Welcome to today's meeting of the Fire, Resilience and Emergency Planning Committee. Please may I remind participants to turn off your devices or put them onto silent mode. Members of the public may like to follow at London Assembly on Twitter and use the hashtag AssemblyFire for this meeting. On the agenda today is a discussion on the London Fire Brigade's draft Community Risk Management Plan. Before I begin, we have a few small items of business. Can I ask our clerk, Diane Richards, to confirm any apologies for today's meeting?
Thank you, Chair. Apologies for absence have been received from Assemblymember Hall, for whom Assemblymember Boff will be substituting, and in accordance with Standing Order 2.4, Assemblymember Rogers will attend the meeting virtually.
Okay, and can we note the list of offices held by Assembly members? And can I also ask members if they have any disclosable pecuniary interests in specific items listed on the agenda? None? Okay. And can we confirm the minutes of the meeting held on the 25th of May, 2022? Okay. And can we note the ongoing actions arising from previous meetings of this committee? Right. That brings us to our main item of business, which is a discussion of reform in London. Can I welcome our guests? We have Fiona Dolman, Director for Transformation of the London Fire Brigade, Jonathan Smith, Assistant Commissioner for Fire Stations, London Fire Brigade, Moira Crane, is that correct? Thank you. Trustee, 2000 Community Action Centre, Kimberly Gordon, Peer Mentor and Advocate from Hoarding, UK, and we are expecting Dilawar Khan, Director of Finance and Engagement for East London Mosque and London Muslim Centre. And joining us remotely today is Dave Sheck, Executive Council Member for the Fire Brigades Union. So that brings us on to our main item of business. I will start with the questions on engaging with communities. And our first question, I'm going to ask of Kimberly and Moira. Kimberly, in your opinion, how well has the Brigade engaged with communities in London during the development of its Community Risk Management Plan and consultation?
Thank you. I formed part of the London Community Steering Committee that took place in January and early February of this year, and there was a lot of work done to reach out to underheard communities, such as people who are hoarding, people in ethnic minority communities, for example, the London Mosque, older communities, etc. And I think as much as it was good to have these meetings, I think there was still kind of a bit of a way to go, especially in terms of hoarding and in engaging with communities that don't seek out the London Fire Brigade as perhaps they wish they did. So I think, as much as I think, perhaps a more proactive approach would be positive.
Okay, and what about you, Moira?
So for me and the community engagement that I took part in, it was really refreshing, actually, because we already had a relationship with our local fire station, which is 2 minutes around the road from where we live. We are a 1966 built estate by the GLA, mostly social housing, very diverse, multicultural, multi-languages, and high density. We've got a lot of overcrowding housing, families above the 9th floor on 22-storey tower blocks. And where I sort of volunteer is the local 2000 Community Action Centre, which is a social tenants hall and a community space where we try to reach out to people. So a lot of meetings take place in there from the local tenants and residents associations, and so we have a lot of grassroots knitted community together. So we already had concerns about domestic items like lumber points, where people store their household waste, their old kitchens, their old fridges, their old beds. And that's how we came into contact with our local station to say, look, we're really worried about this. And they agreed to do a once-a-week tour of the estate and to liaise with the council. So from that then, we had that relationship, and the next step was when they were doing their community plan, they contacted us again, and we were able to galvanise the different agencies and stakeholders that live on the estate. We organised with them a co-partnered fire safety day where we had about 500 people attend, and it was really, really good to see all of the people on the estate come out, because we were also in the middle of a 2-year fire stopping works program during the pandemic, where all our buildings were being, full of contractors, like we were living in a building site. So it was really good to have, after the pandemic, this coming together and the fire brigade being so strong in their presence and being there to answer the questions that we hadn't had answered.
Thank you. That sounds very positive. Dilawar, welcome to the meeting. Dilawar Khan is the Director of Finance and Engagement for the East London Mosque and London Muslim Centre. Dilawar, I was just asking the other stakeholders, we're talking obviously about the Community Risk Management Plan, and I'm just wondering, in your opinion, how well has the Brigade engaged with communities in London during the development of this plan and consultation? I should say, if you just press the button to speak on your microphone. Yeah.
That's it? Okay. Okay. Good morning, everyone. It's the first time here, actually, for me. First time in this city hall, actually. I didn't realize that you've already moved. I knew you were moving. And nice to see Andrew and Sean and others we've met before, and Hina. Okay, it's a pleasure coming here. Yes, how the fire brigade engaged with us. We had engagement with the fire brigade, I think, a couple of years ago. They wanted to speak to us and to take our opinion. So I had a meeting with some of the senior officers during the lockdown over Zoom. They wanted our opinion. And basically, they wanted to engage with us to see how they can improve the services and all that. So I think, we also felt that there is a need from our side. I mean, we can't. That we need to be proactive as well, especially what happened during Grenfell. As you know, a lot of the victims were Muslims, and in fact, about 25 to 30 funeral prayers were performed in our mosque. Where the mayor was present in most of them. So, and that raised a lot of anxiety and concern about the fire in the community. So we consoled our congregation, and anyway, so after that we invited the fire brigade. Said, look, if you really want to understand the community, you need to come and talk to us and find out more about the community. So we invited them to a free course, cultural awareness course. I think about 5 of the officers came initially. That was beginning of this year. And then they came, they felt that it was something to be very useful for other officers, especially senior officers and people who are working the front line. So especially to find out how to engage effectively with the Muslim community. So then they came for a course, about 18 to 25 officers came for a course, and I was one of the presenters, and our imam and others. They really felt that they really learned something, and felt that was overdue, and they should have come earlier and send more officers. So that's what they've realized that, and they requested us to organize a consultation meeting especially with women, because they're the ones who are mainly at home. Still now, many of the first generation Muslim women, many of them don't work. So, and they look after the family and all that. So, so this meeting was organized. Hina was there. There were about 30 to 40 women came. I think it's probably first time in their life they they spoke to the fire brigade, and it was good to see that there are, I think one Muslim woman in hijab. She was a firewoman and I didn't know that there were Muslims in, let alone women. There was Muslims in fire brigade, because we know I engaged with fire brigade some years ago, and they wanted our help in recruiting, and I had a number of meetings with them. I know it's very difficult, for many people, especially from the Muslim community. Not difficult, but there's something there that Muslims are in most professions now, but in the fire brigade, why they're not coming forward? I think the police are doing probably slightly better than in terms of recruitment, but the fire brigade is still a challenge. So this is something we also feel that it's important that we also come forward and help the fire brigade to recruit people from the community. And we offered that we are happy to host job fairs in our center, so that we can get more people. And we also would like to hold more awareness sessions on fire safety at homes, especially. As you know, in Tar Hamlets, we still have more than 150 buildings, cladded buildings. A number of people are still living in the high-rise buildings. So there's a lot of concern and anxiety there. So we feel that we need to do more. And so I think this partnership, we need to build on it and work very closely and more frequently with the fire brigade.
Thank you for that answer. It's really good to hear that by engaging with communities, you're able to also help the fire brigade with recruitment. So, and that's really helpful. Fiona, just coming to you, are you content that the LFB has done all it can to ensure the views of London's diverse communities are heard during consultation, and what has been the biggest challenge?
Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me? I'm always nervous around these microphones, so they make me a bit, what's the word? They're a bit overwhelming, aren't they? It's really great to hear the feedback from yourselves about the way that we've engaged together on developing this plan. We spent a lot of time over the last year to really focus on those communities that are seldom heard because we haven't searched them out, rather than because they're difficult to find, So we spent an awful lot of time doing that. From our consultation that we ran in September, we undertook a risk analysis, gap analysis rather, to really understand actually which communities didn't engage quite so much with us during that consultation. And we found that people who are unemployed or on low incomes, people with disabilities who aren't in employment, people from Black, Asian and minority communities, people looking after children, single parents looking after children who aren't in employment, and people who are in social housing were the people who were least likely to respond and had the lowest response rate. So what we've done for this particular consultation, and we're halfway through it, there are 20 days left to go on this consultation. Now it finishes on the 25th of July. Is we've really looked closely at how we focus our energies on those communities that we haven't heard from so much in previous consultations. And we're doing that in lots of different ways. So we're running community focus groups, which our community engagement team and our borough commanders are leading on. All of our borough commanders are going out and meeting a range of communities, which John will be able to explain a little bit more about as well. And we are spending an awful lot of time over the 6-week period of the consultation, making sure we reach as many communities as possible. We've changed the way that we are supporting people in responding to the consultation as well. So whilst for the consultation we did last September time, we just used Talk London as the platform. What we've done is we've put other steps in place as well this time. So people can respond on paper. So I have a document here. There is a paper consultation response form, and we've got analysts in place to make sure we understand all the input from there. We've got a separate link that can be used for people who find Talk London difficult, so that they can respond as well. And we're working on that with all of our borough commanders so that they make sure that with their local communities and with their local elected representatives, they're having those conversations. So there will always be more that we can do. Always be more that we can do, but we feel that this is an absolute step change in the way that we've consulted to the previous London safety plans right from the very beginning, by starting with talking to our communities rather than that being something we do later, by really listening to our communities about the risks that they feel are most important to them before we write our plan, rather than after writing our plan. So I'd recognise it's a real step change for us, but we're learning all of the time, and there is always more that we can do.
That's great, thank you. I'm going to go to Dave Sheck, who is joining us virtually. Can you hear us, Dave? Yep. Okay, great.
Yeah, I can. Sorry about that.
Okay, no problem at all. I'm just wondering, in terms of your view coming from the FBU, has the FBU felt fully engaged in the development of the CRMP, and do you feel that the LFB has taken on board responses to its initial consultation?
So we've been given, we have had meetings, we've been given general information, but we haven't been given specific details. So, of course, if you're going to say something open like we want to engage with the community, we're going to say, definitely, we should be doing that, and it's right that we do. But we don't know exactly what that means. So, in what sense, what will the fire station's role be, as in firefighters on stations? What will fire safety be doing? You know, what will their specifics be? We haven't done that detail, and to be honest, we want to get it really and work through it.
Okay. Do you feel that the LFB has done enough to ensure its staff have had the opportunity to engage in the development of the CRMP?
Yeah, I mean, they put the survey out. I've personally done it myself as well. But again, it's very open. And like I said, it doesn't really give you any detail of, so one specific question in there was, do you think we should help? So it was something along the lines of, don't quote me on the exact words, but it was along the lines of, what do you think we should help at incidents and help afterwards with aftercare? And it was like, what do you mean by that, by aftercare? Is it, do you want us to work with the community to learn lessons from it? Is it aftercare as in, are you dealing with people after a fire as in patients, because that's when the ambulance would kick in? I said it's really open. So, and obviously if it was dealing with aftercare, there's the point about roles, is in our role map, you know, because that's the NHS's job and the LAS and the police. So like I said, we haven't got enough detail at the minute to really say any more on that.
Okay, thanks, Dave. And I'm going to hand over now to Assemblymember Bakari.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to reiterate what our guest Dilawar just said about the community engagement work that happened at East London Mosque. It was quite inspirational to meet Jamila finally, because I've been asking for a while about the very first hijabi firefighter, and it was a real honour to meet her. And to be at that event just showed you just the kind of work that the LFB are doing and the way they're reaching out. And to use kind of the term hard to reach communities is not correct. It's just the fact that you haven't reached out to them in the first place, and the fact that you've done this work is incredibly powerful. And I do want to also commend Donna Peters, who's the community engagement manager, and all the work that she's done to ensure that this work happens. And on that line about the engagement that you've been doing throughout the process of the CRMP, and to ensure that Londoners are aware of it and understand its aims, and to ensure that the LFE responds to their to ongoing concerns. I want to ask Dilawar first. Are you confident that the London Fire Brigade will continue the work that they're doing in the fashion that they are right now to engage with you after this process as well, not just during it but afterwards as well?
Yeah, our local fire brigade commander, we've built a relationship now, and we feel that we also agreed that we will be taking people to the fire station, for example, our young people and others, to go and see how the fire brigade operates. So there will be two-way communication. Hopefully that will improve our relationship, and I can see that there's goodwill and good intent, and there's from the fire brigade that they really want to engage. Now I've seen that change over the last couple of years.
And Moira and Kimberly, do you agree that? Do you think that this process has not only been engaging and to the extent that you feel it will carry on, but do you feel has been a real understanding as well of the aims and objectives? Kimberly first.
I think in terms of my community, in terms of hoarding, it's an understanding of the process, but also it's a fear of engaging with the London Fire Brigade that my people have as well. They worry that they're going to get in trouble for engaging with the fire brigade. They're worried because they know that there's a safeguarding procedure with the London Fire Brigade in place. They're really scared about engaging with them, and they worry they're going to get in trouble with their landlord, whether they're going to get in trouble with adult social services. We have a focus group with the London Fire Brigade actually next Tuesday, and I am doing one-to-one phone calls trying to get people to come, people who are hoarding to come to that focus group, because they're really worried. And we're looking at doing I don't know if this is going to work, but a virtual focus group where people can have basically their faces hidden because they kind of don't want to be outed, if that makes sense. And it is because of this link with the London Fire Brigade and adult social care. And, we do a support group within one of your training rooms of the London Fire Brigade, and it is brilliant, but some people who get in touch say they could not set foot in a fire brigade, a fire station, because they're so scared of it. So I am trying to break that link, and I'm trying to, involve people and to make people feel a bit more positively about the situation.
I'd just like to thank Donna Peters and Keith Saunders as the Deptford Fire Station Commander. They have been incredible. The first Zoom meeting we had social housing tenants asking us could they speak freely with the LFB and not have their ALMO at that meeting, because contrary to what Kimberly's experience is, people are more likely to speak to the London Fire Brigade, and because they know that they can't be subject to a tenancy threat, or they can be open. So one of the best things about meeting them first was the setting up of that situation where social housing tenants could be really free and bring up whatever they wanted, whoever that incriminated. We weren't about incriminating, but people felt free and ready to join. And from that, it developed lots of Zooms, meetings where residents were contributing, and were glad to contribute. And I think the best thing was the actual community engagement day as well, because it was put in place by the social housing tenants, their own funding with the LFB's funding. So there was, a movement of this is giving us community power to make the changes. So for me, I don't think it's about the LFB per se. I think it's more about the connections to which housing provider you come under, how that then transfers into fire safety, and how you get those links in that chain to work together so we all feel safe and we don't feel that if we raise something we're threatened in terms of prosecution or losing our tenancy.
So would you say that you think the structures have been set up fine so far with the LFB? You're more concerned about the structures outside of that, so the local council authorities, and other agencies? Is that your main concern rather than the LFB structures at the moment?
Yeah, I think if you ring, and we know that if we have fire, we can ring the LFB and they will pick up the phone and somebody will be there 24/7. If you have a fire concern and you ring your local Almo, you might get 14 days response when they go. You know what I mean? It's instant feeling of there's somebody there to care. So I think the LFB are doing a great job in trying to move this particular community plan, but I think the work has to be done with the local councils and the Almos and those that are responsible for the blocks that these people actually come to see, because they're the people that are refurbing. They've got different contractors going in and out. Some of them have changed the buildings beyond recognition, you know, so they really have to work together.
I mean, we do need to make sure that we're measuring and that we're constantly monitoring how the LFB are working with all groups that you're representing and more. Do you think that it shouldn't end at this point? And is there a way you could work with the LFB to make sure that this work continues and measure that? Do you want more surveys? Do you want more community action groups? Do you want to have more meetings? Do you want it all set in place? Do you feel that's already there, or do you think we need to just make sure that does happen?
I feel that the building blocks are there. Making the relationship with the local fire station has been a great way of, you know, starting at the bottom and feeling that they're actually touring our estate at the moment. So even that, the thought of them driving their truck around and looking at all the rubbish points gives you that sense of safety, and it desensitizes people, because, you know, if you see a fire truck, it's usually a fire, and so it's making everybody feel a bit safer. So I think going from bottom up working is really key, and I'm happy that on our estate anyway that we have that relationship developed with the local station.
I'm moving on to the LFB, but is there anything else that you'd like to add, either of you? I'm happy for you to.
Yeah. I think there's one other thing we discussed, to have regular information stalls at our mosque from the fire brigade. So they're coming with all this information and, you know, giving people tips on how to be safe at their home. So that's something we'll be working on with our local fire brigade.
I think the other thing that I would add, when I was reading your risk document, hoarding is listed under a behavioural vulnerability, which is alongside terrorism and hoax callers and taking illegal drugs. So it doesn't make you think, oh, you know, they're kind of on side. It should be under a social vulnerability, not a behavioural thing. It's been listed as a mental health condition, not a lifestyle choice. And I think a slight change of wording might get people slightly more on side. I feel like I'm being really negative. I apologise. I really do. But I want to reiterate how wonderful Donna is and the entire community engagement team. It's been a pleasure working with them, and I don't mean to come across all negative. I will try and have a positive spin on my words from now on.
Thank you so much, and you know, it's really important that you're honest. So please don't be afraid to speak your mind in this situation. You're representing a really important group that needs to be heard. And I think, Jonathan, if you want to come in at some of those points, because I think that was really valid. Will there be a change to the way you've worded some of the things that we've just heard here from Kimberly?
So absolutely, I think that's actually a very reasonable and fair challenge back to us in terms of the language that we use within the because that's crucial, and actually there is no need to apologise whatsoever, because that is the value of actually having this challenge back, to make sure that we can take on board the views of all of the communities that we serve, to make sure that we get it right. Because, you know, historically in the past, we've probably tended to take quite a parental approach, if I can put it that way, in terms of the way that we've engaged with communities, as where we would regard ourselves as subject matter experts. Here is our plan. There it is. What do you think? Whereas actually what we're seeing this time is a wholesale shift in terms of having that co-design with the communities that we serve, to make sure that we are engaging on terms that actually mean something to the communities that we serve, which I think is a step change as far as we're concerned. And the point around the work that Donna Peters and her team and the community engagement team have done to really hold a mirror up to us, actually, all of us, you know, senior officers all the way through to fire stations, to make sure that how we're having that engagement with all of the communities we're here to serve is on the right terms. It is actually meaningful for their day-to-day lived experience. And that means having the local fire station utterly rooted in the community that they serve. I mean, and in terms of the points that have been raised about our long-term commitment to this, I think the fact that the language within the CRMP talks about commitments is actually really important, because this is an utter commitment from us as an organisation to London and all of the diverse communities that exist within it and make it the fantastic city that it is that we are utterly committed to work together to deliver a 21st century first-class fire and rescue service that the capital deserves. And we can only do that if we are co-designing what our services look like, and that means listening to the communities that we serve, taking on board the perfectly legitimate challenge that comes back. You know, I'm really heartened to hear what is going on out there on local fire stations with borough commanders who have really gripped, actually, the engagement with the CRMP. But the CRMP is just the start. You know, moving forward, we'll have a community engagement strategy, which takes on board a lot of the learning, both from the CRMP engagement and from the pilot boroughs that we ran at the end of last year in 21. And there's lots of learning that comes from that, so that actually, particularly if I'm talking about the staff that I have responsibility for on our fire stations and in our boroughs, are actually comfortable in this space, are engaging in a way that really is going to have the maximum impact in terms of delivering those local services that people need. So, as I say, there's never any need to apologise. It's absolutely right that we have challenged back, because that is how we are going to get better and make sure that we are relevant to the needs of London and Londoners.
Thank you, Jonathan. I think Dave Sheck would like to make a comment too. He's online.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, I think it was a really important point that Kimberly made there, and it was something that we raised concerns about in the past, about the perception of the fire service when you're linked to other groups. For example, she mentioned social care. We also said it about police. When you're seen as working alongside police, the community sometimes don't engage as much, and it really is a key message that needs to come out as a service, that we are separate and we are approachable. So I think it was a really good point that she brought up, and I'm glad Jonathan said it's going to be addressed later on.
Great, thank you. There's it's something to be proud of. You've made a little change there already, so keep going. We might do some more later on. I just want to talk about the social impact tool that LFB are doing at the moment. How will this be measuring the impact that LFB is having on communities, and what further work is needed on the social impact tool, and how will this be reflected in the final CRMP? Do you want to answer that for me, Fiona, or Jonathan? Yeah, Fiona first.
Sure. So this is work that's ongoing at the moment. It's not finished yet. So for us, the social impact tool is it's a framework, and it's a toolkit for our local station teams to help them to understand and value and kind of understand the impact of the community engagement that they're undertaking locally. So it's really, really important. It's a framework that gives them tools to help them find different ways to support their local communities and engage with their local communities. And it's to really kind of help us to look at and understand, when you're thinking about business cases to undertake work, to get investment, how you actually consider the social impact of the work that you're undertaking. So, you know, when you're thinking about cost-benefit analysis, you're actually talking about the social benefit in monetary terms as well, which is really important when you're trying to establish a case. So it does a range of different things, particularly around giving local stations greater autonomy, greater ability to utilise tools to help them to engage more with their local community. It's also one of the areas of metrics that we've got in terms of really understanding how our plan is actually delivering the outcomes that we've set out. So that's going to be important to us as we work through the first year of the plan, to understand how we can really make that sort of social impact tool and then the community impact assessment work together for us to understand the impact that we're having locally, rather than pan-London. We do quite a lot pan-London, And for us, this plan is all about making sure that we engage with people locally, we understand how they feel locally, we give our teams locally the sort of the autonomy that they need to enable them to service their communities in the right way. So that's why you'll also see in some of the metrics that we've broadened them out a little bit so that there is flexibility locally. Some boroughs might need to do more home fire safety visits, for example. Some might need to do less, and to enable them to focus on the more vulnerable people in their community. So we're trying to make this flexible so that it can flex and shift to meet what is needed from our communities.
Great, and I'm sure that we'll be looking at that again as well, just to kind of like look at those metrics that you've just mentioned. My very last question is that linked to what Dilawar was mentioning earlier about Jamila, our first hijabi firefighter, which is fantastic. But has there been any progress, and can you give us any updates on the Lfes You Can campaign, which is supposed to be attracting Black, Asian, minority ethnic communities, and how is that going to feed into the Crmp?
So in terms of where we're moving to make sure, it's been an utter commitment, obviously, from the brigade, and the Commissioner has spoken about it passionately, that London Fire Brigade needs to reflect and look like London. But what we completely appreciate is we are still some distance from that. But we are starting to see now success in terms of our recruitment, the demographics of our staff coming through at firefighter development level is now looking much more reflective of London. I think the last 2 recruit rounds came back with 35% from Black ethnic and minority groups. There's a much even spread of gender as well. So once we start getting that bit right, as far as our recruitment is concerned, and making sure that the London Fire Brigade in the short, medium and longer term is starting to look and reflect London, that's going to have huge impact as far as the brigade is concerned, because one of the key things for inclusion for us is that we cannot be a high-performing organisation, a forward-thinking organisation, unless we are genuinely inclusive and we genuinely reflect London and Londoners. And people need to see it as well. I mean, I think with Jamila, where she's so powerful is that people can actually see that actually this is a role for everybody, as Dilawar was saying, and it was a conversation we had at the East London Mosque a couple of weeks ago at that session. That actually even Dilawar from the community wasn't aware that actually this was a career path for Muslim women, and I think that's so important. That if you can't see it, you can't be it. There's that famous phrase, and that is so true. So what we're starting to really see is that coming through at a firefighter development level, and that will obviously filter through the organisation as we come through. But what we also appreciate is that we have to be relentless. And we have to be restless as far as that is concerned, because you can have diversity as far as your recruitment is concerned, but if you're not a genuinely inclusive organisation, you run the risk of failing. And that's where some of the challenges we're openly discussing at the moment around our culture, with the culture review, which is obviously going to report towards the end of this year. It is critical we understand our culture in all corners of the organisation, because that's the only way we can expose areas that we need to, celebrate excellent practice where we see it, and then it's only by doing that we will then make sure that the brigade is as inclusive as it needs to be, because actually that will then make us that high-performing organisation that we need to be, as well as being morally the right thing to do.
Thank you very much, and I really am very grateful for the time that you've allowed me to get involved with this as well. It's been a real honour to see the work that you've been doing, particularly with the Muslim community, because I think it's been some vital work there. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Assemblymember Bailey has a follow-up to that, but then he's going to take us on to the assessment of risk.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. It's just addressed to Kimberly, really. You made a comment that your community, Hoarding community, find it very hard to engage with the London Fire Brigade. Is that just because they're the authority who has to deal with this issue as your members would see it, or is it something that's happened in the past?
I mean, every element of services have to engage with people with hoarding behaviour. London Fire Brigade is no different to that. It is quite a secretive behaviour, so sometimes it's the London Fire Brigade who kind of find them out, and it's, well, what happens next? There is a scale of hoarding. It's called the clutter image rating. It runs from 1, which is pristine, to 9, which is you can't get into a room. And it's around about the level 5, that 5 to 6, that the London Fire Brigade essentially have to note down the address, have it on record, so that if there is an incident, they can bring more equipment, etc., more manpower. And then they also have to make a safeguarding reference to adult social care, which, because we are, it's likely that we're talking about low-income households, so there might be local authority housing involved as well, and that could create an issue with their tenancy. So it's just it's the fear of what's going to happen. And I mean, in an ideal world, what I would like to do is break that link so that a referral is perhaps made to a partner with the London Fire Brigade in that particular borough, maybe not Hoarding UK, I think it should go out to tender, and a proactive approach taken, get some funding to actually help the individual before social services and housing get involved. So that's the idea. I know it's a pipe dream, but that's what I would like to see.
Well, thank you for that. Some of the best things in the world start as a pipe dream.
Yeah.
I should want to talk to Jonathan to direct this question. Jonathan, how do you think the lessons from the Grenfell Tower fire and the ongoing inquiry have been incorporated into the CRMP?
So I think the running throughout the CRMP is that constant theme that we've had to learn those very hard lessons that we've learned from the Grenfell Tower fire. As the committee, when they visited Paddington a couple of months ago and actually saw the practical examples of how we've moved the brigade forward in terms of the new technology that we're using, the new policy and procedure, the new ways of working that demonstrate actually in a very practical sense how the brigade has moved forward. And obviously that's a reflection of a lot of the recommendations that came out from the phase 1 inquiry and our complete acceptance as an organisation that we needed to improve in all of those areas. I think what you see in the CRMP specifically is that utter commitment to the communities of London. One of the biggest challenges we face, and I know the Commissioner has spoken about it passionately, is around the community, particularly the Grenfell community, felt that we took a step back in the aftermath of the incident, that we weren't as engaged as we could have been in their greatest hour of need. Whereas what you have in the CRMP is our utter commitment, including a new service as far as community recovery is concerned, to make sure that we're never again in that space. And we've already seen that start to play out. So if the New Providence Wharf fire, which occurred last year, and which is an incident that's close to my heart, as I was the incident commander for that particular incident, if you look at the way the brigade engaged with that community post the event, we have never really committed that type of resource and that real determination to support that community in that way before. Even other incidents that were perhaps less high profile. Was a significant incident down in Norbury a couple of weeks ago, and even then, in the 2 or 3 days afterwards, you saw the local crews actually working very closely with the community to support all of those who were involved. So I think when you see the CRMP, there's a number of elements here that talk about our commitment to excellence, to make sure that we are continually driving continuous improvement, which is critical if we're going to make sure that we're relevant to the emerging risks that sit within London, an utter commitment to the communities of London to make sure that actually their needs and wants run through everything that we do, and then to make sure that our fire stations and our boroughs are those community hubs, that fire stations are not just a place where firefighters go to work, but they are a genuine community asset that people feel that they co-own. And once we start to push that through, I think that's where you will see the legacy of Grenfell run through the CRMP moving forward.
Do you think you struck the right balance between what the draft CRMP would refer to as people-related risks, and such as people vulnerabilities, people hoard, etc., like that, and the more traditional major area risks? Because the upthrust of Grenfell was the fire brigade wasn't prepared, didn't have the right equipment, all that kind of stuff. And from a technical point of view, you've responded to that. But there's another line that we're talking about this morning, is that where was the fire brigade as a community asset, where people were related to, you could give education over a longer period, more sustained. Do you think you struck the balance between that in your CRMP?
I think my answer to that is I would never see that as an either or. I think they have to be two sides of the same coin. That, our assessment of risk and our utter determination to make sure that that's people-centred is absolutely right. But I think your point is very well made. There are still technical elements that come with that to make sure that we are a professional fire and rescue service, and we have to make sure our operational performance is actually as good as it should be that capital would expect. And I think you see that in the commitments within the CRMP. One of the things about learning from you under one of the pillars that sits in there is that actually we are learning with communities to make sure that actually we are training properly, to make sure that our equipment is as good as it can be, to make sure we are using modern technology. And that's a people-centred approach, as well as the very technical elements to make sure that as a fire and rescue service we are as professional and as capable and as structured as we need to be to deal with the types of incidents that we know London is going to face both now and in the future.
Thank you. To what extent do you think the LFB is engaged with and learned from other fire and rescue services, including considering international services as well in the development of the risk and the proposed key performance indicators around the CRMP? Because, of course, the thing that struck me about Grenfell, I was born in that area, I lived near there, but everybody knew that block, and a couple of the other ones were an absolute nightmare. They're just terrible in every single way, the one staircase being sort of the sort of centrepiece of that. But there's other cities across the world who have great deal of high-rise living, and have we learnt any lessons from them? We certainly didn't seem to in the past, but have we learnt any going forward? Do you have conversations planned or ongoing about how they deal with their fire risk with all their high-rise living?
So the short answer to that is yes, and that's one of the key learnings that has come out from Grenfell as well. In terms of, I think historically, LFB perhaps had not engaged both with the National Fire Chiefs Council and CFOA as it was previously, and internationally. When you look at other global cities, for example, that have very similar challenges to London, had we as a brigade really understood the challenges that they faced and then learn those lessons so that make sure that feeds everything that we do in London, I think the answer to that would be no. But I think one of the legitimate challenges that has come back and has arisen through Grenfell is that actually we need to be much more open, we need to be much more forward-thinking and forward-facing. And one of the big changes we've made is there's a department that is looking at research and development within our operational policy and assurance department to do exactly the type of work that you described, that is actually looking at, well, what are the trends internationally and nationally? What does that mean for us as an organisation, and how can we make sure our response arrangements are appropriate? So a couple of good examples would be lithium-ion batteries and some of the challenges that we're facing with new and emerging technology, which we have taken a real lead as a brigade in helping to influence the National Fire Chiefs Council, including co-developing a presentation by ourselves as LFB with the NFCC in partnership with the University of Newcastle, to really understand lithium-ion batteries and what that means for us operationally and how we bring them under control. And that, I don't think, is something we would have done in the pre-Grenfell era, because we were probably far too, if we're brutally honest, we were too insular in the way that we operated, when actually there is an awful lot we can learn both from fire and rescue services in the UK and internationally, and that has to continue. The nature of risk in the 21st century is evolving at such pace that if we're not taking advantage of all of the information and research that is out there, then we're going to be found wanting again in the future, which is something we're utterly committed not to do.
Okay. Let me just sneak this on the end. We talked in your aforementioned Measuring Our Success document, you state we will report to our progress against these key performance indicators to the public and stakeholders regularly. How will you do this, and how regularly will you report? Because currently you are under some scrutiny, particularly because of Grenfell, and I'd argue, on balance, you're making changes. You've been very open as an organisation to some of your failings, which has been excruciating for you, but you've stuck to it, and I commend you for that. But how will we see the reports? Because one of the real problems for London is lots of sweet words and then no KPIs to judge progress against. So how will you do that, and how regularly?
Thank you, Sean. I think that's a really, really good question. I've been in the organisation for 2 years now, and one of the things that I've been really focused on is how do we make our performance information much more transparent, much more easy to understand, and much less narrative-based? Because it's really easy to tell a good story, and actually the data should speak for itself.
Yes, couldn't agree
more. Part of our consultation document is this one, as you just mentioned, the Measuring Our Success document. And what you'll find in there is a different approach to how we will present our data and how we will present our KPIs. So we will use a different approach. It won't be kind of red, amber, green target based. We will look at each metric and say, is that in the right range? And we will show you actually our performance over time. So you don't just see point numbers, you see our performance over time and how that is emerging. We're looking at the ways in which we can make sure that there is much, as I said, a much greater focus on the numbers rather than the explanation, because the numbers should stand up for themselves. And we are planning to produce that on a quarterly basis. What we also want to do, which is again a shift from the last few years, is in our first year, is we've got a set of metrics that we're consulting on and a set of metrics that we want to develop further. So we want to make sure that we're flexible enough that if issues arise that we aren't measuring, that we work them into our KPIs that we publish so that we can demonstrate that we are learning as we go as well, and we will introduce new metrics as we need to. So we're trying to make it much more flexible, much more transparent, and we'll do that on a quarterly basis. So you will no doubt read our current quarterly performance report. That's a weighty tome. So we're aiming to make it a smaller document that's much more focused on the data, that is published quarterly, and that evolves as we go through the period of the CRMP.
Thank you for that. Appreciate that, Chair.
Yeah, thank you. Assemblymember Duvall.
Thank you. Can I turn to the stakeholders? And we've been talking about risks throughout, about the way the LFB does its work. Now I'd like to focus in on the assessment of risk. So really the first question, I think we'll start with Kimberly and go along if I may. Do you think the assessment of risk successfully covers the most important risks for the communities that you represent? And what more should the LFB be doing to build on the understanding of risk that Londoners face? So, Kimberly, I think we touched on little bits about your specific community. Just take us through the answers to that question, those sets of questions.
I mean, in terms of my community, the assessment of risk is, it's a fire safety home visit. They look at an escape path. They look at any other kind of risky factors, for example, smoking. They look at how cluttered a kitchen is around gas appliances. And my understanding is they make suggestions for improvements. But it's a challenge because, and I think that's all very, very good. And I hear positive feedback in terms of that and how people are kind and they're very, very proactive. I do sometimes get referrals from the London Fire Brigade, and I can't do anything about them because I get a name, an address, and that's it. And because of data protection, because of privacy and consent, I can't actually take anything further. Plus, we don't have the resources to go and approach every single person who we know the name of address of who is hoarding. So I think that the way that the London Fire Brigade approach the people who are hoarding, who do let them in, is largely positive. But I think it'd be good to work with the London Fire Brigade, and that's what we're planning on doing currently. With Donna and team, and with other fire brigades, other fire stations throughout London, what are the next steps? It's not just a letter to adult social care. It's like, actually, what can we do to work together to improve the lives of these people, and so that they can live a bit better, have less anxiety, but actually improve the safety of not just their home, but the homes around them. The University of East Anglia just did a really, really good paper, and where they looked at a local authority in Norwich, and actually the struggles that the local authorities and the services have of, especially in high-rise buildings, they need to look after the person who's hoarding, but they also have to look after the people around them as well. They have a duty of care to everybody, and that can seem in conflict with each other. Okay. So it's working in a person-centred approach, a kind approach, and, you know, making the correct introductions, I think, to...
Okay. So I get that, the gap between, so on prevention, I mean, I think you opened it up into some wider issues around organisational responses, not just the LFB, about how do you, once you identify an issue, individual of where they are, but the gap that you would identify in the risk is the one where we identify a property or a person that's at risk, and then what do we do? What do the different agencies do in terms of referrals? So the you in civil society, the LFB and council, I presume, we've got to get that bit right and try and work on those issues.
And I think the challenge is, you know, hoarding is dealt with by adult social care, generally, the statutory route, and every local authority is slightly different. So it's, I mean, what I would like to see happen is if somebody who's hoarding comes to light by the London Fire Brigade, we can put a plan of action around, a person-centred plan of action to actually help the individual, instead of making them feel like they're going to get kind of told upon.
So there's a statutory one about children, isn't there? There's a one where agencies get together and they can monitor that and identify that. We know it's not perfect, but it's there in place. There's actually a semi-statutory one around domestic violence of prevention that, you know, is not perfect, but it's there. So you would say that's probably the gap that we should be looking at there. How do we stop people slipping through that gap? And there needs to be some awareness of organisations not passing people on because you can't deal with them, but making sure the appropriate agency is dealing with it. So the LFB wouldn't be dealing with it. It's about that interaction back with other agencies. And I think part of the risk of prevention, that's got to be something we got to take on, the LFB, haven't they, in terms of that for prevention or wherever. Okay, I get that. Dalawa, can we come to you? And I know you're representing the Muslim community, but of course it's much more wider, isn't there? Because there are some cultural aspects of South Asian community in terms of prevention and all the rest of it. So in those risk assessment needs, in terms of some of the interactions you've had with the fire, or maybe some conversations you've had, where do you think the gaps potentially could be? Where you think we could probably do better, or we should be working towards? It might not be perfect now, but we can actually pick this up.
Yeah, I think at homes, especially, we need to educate the families how to be safe. And I gave one example in the consultation where I experienced fire because 3 of us in our house, we made mistakes, and as a result, it could have been really detrimental. So my wife, she put the oil, left the oil in the oven.
Yeah.
Right. My daughter turned on the wrong oven. Okay, instead of turning the one that she put the chicken in, she put the other one on, and there was a fire in the oven, and it was on the wedding day of my son. So, and the mistake I made when I saw the fire, I opened the oven. You see, all these things, there was experience for us, and had I known these things earlier, we could have prevented. My whole house. I'd like to congratulate again the fire service. They did a wonderful service. Within few minutes, they came, and they managed to, put out the fire. So this is I think. So if I was thinking if I'm lacking in this knowledge, there must be so many other people in our community that don't know this basic things, and probably we could prevent a lot of fires if we provide the right level of education to them.
So it's really about that awareness issue of potential flashpoints in the households,
Yes.
and about practices. Do you know what I mean? In terms
Yeah.
of what we're, so if you're cooking with oil, you're just got to be aware about its properties and where it is and the appropriateness.
Yeah, and also to keep,
I
like,
can't
say,
think of a more
yeah.
stressful event to be in terms of a potential wedding ceremony and everything else going on around it.
Yeah, it could have been really bad. But like having a fire blanket and fire extinguishers, I think from my experience of looking at my family, extended family, I don't think any of them have this, at hand. This kind of things, it could be lifesaver. I bought it after the incident, but we need to pass on this message as much as we can to the community.
Okay, so I suppose it's how do we continuously do that messaging? I mean, obviously we need to take some responsibility, but what can other agencies do to help?
Yeah.
So, it comes to mind about some of that issue is about, tenancy. Well, it's not just that. I mean, it's quite interesting about the orders, isn't it? The people that slip through the gap, in my mind, just listening to the earlier conversation, is going to be those who live in the private sector, who suffer with an hoarding problem, and unless someone picks it up, they're going to slip through. Yeah, it's all very well talking about tenancy enforcement and landlord enforcement. That's more likely to happen. It's someone who's living on their own with a particular problem, unless the agencies come across them. Do you know what I mean? And their interactions. But just going back to those issues, so you think just continue the awareness raising, allowing people who can, but also getting those agencies that are interacting with people, making sure that the safety issue, the safety messages are there. So the role, do you think in terms, I'm not particularly picking on or identifying your particular community, because I think it's a problem for all communities, do you think the role of the engagement with young people from an early age in terms of some of those messages is quite an important one that we in society need to take on board more? So making young people much more aware of some of those safety issues in terms of the kitchen or in terms of cooking practices and what to do in those circumstances when they go wrong. Do you think there's a role there?
I think so.
We need to identify.
Yeah. I think we need to make this start early at the education from schools, even from primary schools. Sometimes you see what happens when the children learn, the parents also learn as well. Yeah. So they will come and talk to their moms and dads and like, don't do this, don't do that. I think that'll be. I think it's a great idea to start with the children, and that will probably go upwards and cascading rather than down. It will go up.
Okay, Moya, what's your view?
I should say that the first time I really got involved with thinking about fire safety was when I was employed at a hotel, 826 bedroom by Tower Bridge, and that involved going to 6 monthly meetings. Every month we'd have quizzes, and because it was a business. But I think that we should think of every household or every block as a business, and we should put in the same effort. From school. If you do more education in school about fire, then you get the English as a second language dispelled, because lots of children will be speaking. They come into our centre, they're filling out forms for their families and their older people. I said, so at every level, but I think from school, from youth clubs, from, just doing community days. We had a situation on Peeps where we had our sort of 18 to 25-year-olds acting as fire marshals for the day. So it gives them some, buy-in to the day. And they have nowhere to go. They have no youth club. So they might be the sort of children older children, hanging about the estate, sitting in stairwells, maybe having a smoke. Do you know what I mean? But all of that education filters through. So I think if you want to reach, you start with your local fire station, with your local primary schools, with your local grassroots organisations, your local hubs, and for the masses, I know we're only talking about London here, but television, adverts and reminders of Grenfell, it really has reached a lot of people and making them think about how safe they are in their actual homes and how little sometimes they have power to make the place that they live safe, because it depends on the council, it depends on the landlord, it depends on the fire brigade, do you know what I mean? But given that bit of co-ownership and education would go far, I think.
Okay, let's bring Dave in, if you're online, from an employee perspective. And I suppose the question to the FBU is, do you think the assessment of risk successfully covers the most important risks for the LFB staff? And in what ways could the LFB do more?
Yeah, more can always be done, Len. What we've been saying from day dot is there's not enough funding. I mean, I've listened to all the points in this debate at the minute, and there was talk about what are the LFB doing about stairwells. A lot of that's down to building regulations and deregulation, which we spoke about. So what are the government doing about that? This has to be a joint working effort from everyone, including the government. There was also talk about fire safety. That requires funding. A lot of our fire safety people don't earn enough money, and there's not enough of them. So everything we want to do, we want to be involved. I agree with what everyone's saying here, that everyone needs to work together, but there's such a lack of funding. I see mentioned in here climate change. We attend floodings, but we don't have a statutory duty for it, and it's not funded. I mean, we want to do all these things in the fire service, but we need funding for it. And if you want to do things properly, it all comes down to funding, and that needs to come from central government. So as much as we're all saying the LFB will do this and that, there's only so much you can do with a lack of funding, and that really needs to be addressed.
And I suppose that's incumbent on the people that either provide money or direct and task the LFB, that they've got to make sure that if your staff turn up to a job, that they at least have some of the kit or some of the training to be able to do that job. And we all know prevention is better than turning up to the job. That's what we really aim to do, isn't it? But in that sense, Dave, from the spirit that you were answering the question, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but do you think there's a consensus emerging, and I think there's a consensus emerging this morning, that we all understand some of the risks and priorities that we need to do? Yes, we'd all like more, but we're getting there in terms of post. Look, there's been all sorts of incidents. I wouldn't want to detract from learning from incidences of the past, but post-Grenfell, that we are going to be in a better place than where we've come from. Things will get better for both staff, people facing potential risks, and the people that oversee the service. Is that where you would emerge from, even though I think your central preface is we need more resources, more money, we can do a better job? Is that correct?
Yeah, I would say that there has been improvements, definitely. Speaking for the London Fire Brigade, I think they're a bit limited because of funding. I mean, we have got a problem at the minute with safety because there is a lack of machines on the run due to issues in the fire service. But I mean, again, someone mentioned learning off other global fire services. As a comparator, you use New York, Hong Kong, for example. They're very similar population sizes to London. They get a lot more funding than London gets, a hell of a lot more, so why aren't we getting that level of funding to improve things? It's all very well we're saying there are improvements, and I've seen improvements myself, by the way, so I am saying that, but we can always do better, and The only way you're going to do better is if you get proper funding, which I don't believe we get.
Yeah, I think that's a difficult one. We'd all want to, I think there's a consensus in the room, even from some of my Conservative colleagues, that we need some more money to do the ultimate. Let's move on to a much other challenge facing the capital and the LFB, and that's when we have issues of dealing with terrorism and risk associated with that. So, of course, in terms of the Community Risk Management Plan, describes as a step change in how the LFB deals with terror-related incidents. So, LFB, can you tell us more about this risk and what London has said and what the LFB is doing to mitigate this major risk?
So this has been a key issue for us. It was one of the key concerns that came up last year as part of the consultation in terms of the strategic direction for LFB moving forward, and the issue of terrorism and terror-related response is one that has really developed at some pace over the course of the last 20 years, and the particular challenges that London faces as the capital of the United Kingdom, with all of the targets that sit here. Interestingly, just listening to Dave and the FBU there, one of the things I'm most proud about in terms of what the LFB has been able to do over the course of the last 18 months is work with the FBU to come to an agreement on marauding terrorist attacks, for example. Because if we think back to 2017 and the number of attacks that the capital was subjected to, and then we only need to be reminded on the news from yesterday coming out from the States, from Denmark prior to that, and obviously in Norway last week, that this threat continues to evolve, it continues to exist, and the London Fire Brigade has an absolute duty to make sure that our staff are prepared, trained, ready, equipped to deal with any type of incident that they may realistically be asked to face, and of course to make sure that the service we deliver is reflective of the needs of London. Now, with the Lord Harris review that was recommissioned by the Mayor last year, reported in March, and what that was doing was looking at the previous Harris review from back in 2016 and the progress that London collectively had made in terms of its preparedness to deal with an act of terror. The encouraging thing for, I think, this committee is that the conclusions from that report, and its extremely extensive report, which still has 294 recommendations, for example, that sit there, but the overarching conclusion that London is now better prepared than it was back in 2016-17, and I think the London Fire Brigade can take some heart in terms of what was actually evidenced in that report, particularly around marauding terrorist attack, particularly around our capability around a chemical, biological or radiological incident, in terms of how we work with our partners, particularly counter-terror policing and the security services, and making sure that there is that joined-up partnership working, including with the London Resilience Forum. But one of the things that's in the CRMP that's so important, particularly when it comes to dealing with terrorism, is that we have to be flexible, because the attack methodology, the motivations are evolving over time. If we think back to 20 years ago, really, to the attacks on the Twin Towers, very sophisticated, very highly organised, well-trained terrorists committing a significant act of terror, through to what we've seen in 2017 and latterly, where it's often perpetrated by an individual using very crude weaponry, which is actually very difficult for the security services to pick up. What it means is that emergency responders need to be flexible, adaptable, to be able to deal with all types of incidents as and when they occur. And because of the work we've done with the Fire Brigades Union, because of actually the funding that the Mayor and the GLA has put into that, means that as we move forward, and certainly over the course of the next 18 months, we are better prepared to deal with these acts of terrorism than we've ever been before. But again, it's something we can't be complacent about. There's still 8 specific recommendations in the Lord Harris review directed to the London Fire Brigade, which we will need to work through. But as far as the CRMP is concerned, evidencing that very clear threat that we know we face in London, and then making sure our response is as flexible, as well-resourced and as capable as it needs to be, is going to help keep London safe and keep our staff safe as well.
Okay, so where are we on the 8 recommendations? How far have you got with those? What's been agreed? What's not been agreed?
So we've got to send back a formal response by the end of the year in terms of mapping the progress against those recommendations. I mean, a lot what was in there was actually just endorsing what we've said about marauding terrorist attacks. So particularly that level 2 specialist capability across all of our front line, and that's a piece of work that's going on at the moment. So our team in operational resilience and control is conducting that training of our staff as we speak, and we expect to see that develop over the course of the next 18 months. There's some elements in there that are more straightforward to do. So one of the recommendations was talking about our London Cbrn group, which we chair, making sure that it fully links in with the National Cbrn Centre, both in terms of fire and police, and that's a very legitimate recommendation to put in there. And then there's some elements around funding. So one of the points that was made at the end of the recommendations for LFB was around how do we attract, talking of the previous conversation on funding, is how do we make sure that actually funding for counter-terror response actually might be beneficial if that came directly to fire rather than through counter-terrorism policing as it does at the moment. Now, our relationship with CT policing is such that that's never caused us an issue in terms of making sure we've got what we've needed, but actually is there a legitimate argument for the London Ambulance Service or the London Fire Brigade or any other emergency service to have dedicated funding to deal with these types of incidents, knowing that our role to mitigate them is so crucial? Then I think that's a legitimate argument to put forward.
And do you, just as a side issue, do you think in terms of not arriving at once an incident is ongoing, but in a preventative role, if you're asked to turn up and you have time, do you think your skills of evacuation would be used by your colleagues in other emergency services? So if we get a tower block that's potentially at risk from a terror situation and we have time to do something about that, do you think you'd be called on, your expertise around knowing some of the nature of the buildings on the patch will be used by some of those services that will be doing command and control on the day that might not want to listen to what you're having to say? Do you think that's part of the risk around that in leadership of some of these incidences?
Well, I think it's both part of the risk, and I think it's both part of the opportunity that exists here. So one of the main drivers really to secure the agreement around marauding terrorist attack was that what that does then bring to bear is the full weight of the London Fire Brigade to deal with these types of incidents when they occur, because actually what do we have? We have very well trained, very well equipped, very capable firefighters and officers who operate in high-risk environments all of the time. And actually it's about bringing that resource to bear when we're dealing with acts of terrorism, which I think is going to be one of the knock-on impacts of the agreement that we've now got in place, and how the LFB's role when dealing with acts of terrorism is going to continue to evolve. And one of the other elements, and it's one of the recommendations actually that's in the Harris review, is around our role in prevent. Yeah. Because of the relationships that we have with communities, we're able to cross thresholds in a way that other agencies aren't able to do so. And I think it's a legitimate point that was raised in the report, that actually, given the success that firefighters have had in terms of risk reduction as far as fire is concerned, that we would look to use that to maximum impact as far as prevent is concerned, and actually de-radicalisation and spotting the signs and symptoms of radicalisation when we go and do home fire safety visits, for example. So that is definitely something we're going to take forward. The Commissioner chairs the NFCC's Counter-Terror Strategic Board, and there is now a representative on that board specifically to look at prevent, and with fire actually stepping up and being able to take full advantage of the opportunities it has because of the nature of the way that the fire service is viewed nationally. And I think that's a very legitimate argument in terms of our added value in counter-terror response that we've probably not fully utilised in the past. So that's definitely an area for growth moving forward.
Now, let's turn to, thank you very much for that, and let's turn to stakeholders and the FBU as well. So, look, we've all got a role in counter-terrorism, and whether it's a specialist type looking at the aspects, but is there anything you've heard, or is there any comments in terms of the consultation that you feel ought to be taken on board? Bearing in mind, terrorist attacks come in all shapes and forms, and it's not always one form of terrorism that we face the threat of in terms of our communities. So who wants to kick off first? We'll go this end. Moira, we'll put you on the spot. It may not be the number one priority of some of the people that you come into contact with, but how do we make it? Because everyone needs to be aware of the potential risk around that.
So we have things happen on our inner estates that to us are terrorism, with young boys being stabbed on the streets, and we're encouraging them to be open and to cooperate with inquiries and stuff like that. For me, again, it's about being able to give an avenue to all people that no matter what they're going to say isn't going to be used against them, or they won't be dragged into something, that everybody can reach a place where they can declare something is happening, not ignore it, do you know what I mean, not want to get involved. Even coming this morning on the DLR, I was like, oh my God, this is so packed, you know, and I was worried about the safety of the DLR this morning, COVID and all sorts of things. Yeah. But, you know, we've all been and lived through these incidents on the TV. I had a friend of mine that was on the bus at Tavistock Square, lost a leg. You know, the touching of terrorist incidents is getting closer to people every day because we live more next to each other. But I just think an awareness that people have an opportunity to get involved and co-own most of this stuff, and they're not, you know, disenfranchised.
Dolman.
From our perspective, I think the fire brigade they already played a role in dealing with terrorism. You know, the 7/7. I mean, their role was very paramount. You know, the way they rescued people from the bombed trains and buses and all that. So I think they've got the skills, and especially as you said, in evacuating people safely from, if a building, God forbid, was bombed, you know, they will have a primary duty there. From our perspective, our building, probably most of you seen it, East London Mosque. We've been told by the SO15 or the counter-terrorism department that we are potentially one of those buildings that can be attacked, you know. Especially after the Finsbury Park, you know, this incident in Finsbury Park. So we've been working with the council to see how they can put some sort of safe flower pots and other things in place so that people don't just barge into a building with a lorry or something like that. Especially on Fridays and Eid days, we have thousands of people. On Eid day, we get 20,000 people come into a building in 5 congregations, and Friday 7,000. So we are at risk of having, you know, getting this kind of attack by somebody. I was thinking, okay, how can the fire brigade actually contribute in terms of in our safety when it comes to this kind of incidents? You know, especially so if there was an attack. How we can evacuate people quickly and safely. That's something probably we can have a session with the fire brigade and that, you know, probably help, you know.
And Kimberly, I know it's a bit of a niche area, but in terms of, you know, people with special needs and understanding what threats are and where. So, you know, it would be very interesting. People with mental illnesses in times of woe, when there's an emergency in their area, and never mind trying to deal with their day-to-day problems that they may be facing. Do you know what I mean?
For sure, and I'd like to second what these two have said, but also I think, you know, London is a magical city. You've got so many people living in buildings very, very close to the city centre. You know, I myself walk into Oxford Circus if I want to go in because it is so close. And I think, you know, in terms of terrorism, when you've got residential buildings so close to commercial where that could be a target for terrorism, I think what would be really interesting is a kind of more of a rollout, especially with those with mental health. What do you do? And not if you suspect somebody, that we have on the tube, etc. There's the rollout there. But what, if a terrorism attack is happening, what do you do? And that, I think, for mental health is something that if it became more something that you just know what to do. I know that all terrorism attacks are different, but as an example, it's not the same thing. But I was in a car accident the other day, and I knew what to do. I knew exactly what to do, and my mother-in-law had no idea. And I think that's because from a very, very young age, it was bred into me. If you're in a car accident, this is what you do. And so maybe because there is more residential around the more commercial elements of it, more of a rollout of okay, what do you do if you're in the middle of it?
So generally, I suppose, whether it's a terrorism attack or a major other emergency that the fire service faces, we need to try to prepare people, isn't it? So if you're facing the oil fire in the kitchen, what do you do? If you're facing a potential terrorism attack in a building where you are, what do you do? And I suppose that's really some of the issues that we could work on from a fire perspective of what the FB should be looking at and where it is. But thank you for the way that you've answered all the questions, except one last thing. I didn't ask the FBU that last contribution around some of the issues about terrorism. Dave, have you got any comments on that?
Yeah, I think we need to be aware of the danger of the right-wing radicalisation. That's definitely something that's emerged in recent years. We also need to consider post-COVID discrimination, particularly in the Asian community. And very much supporting what Jonathan said, really, about it being positive. It's still very much a work in progress, and with things constantly changing, we're going to be constantly in meetings. We've got some hopefully getting booked in very soon to do further work on it. Cheers, Len.
Thank you.
Thank you. Assembly Member Polanski.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, all. If I can start with a thank you to the Assistant Commissioner and to Fiona for being at Pride this weekend, and also for the Pride breakfast. It meant a lot, I'm sure, to LGBT officers and me as a gay man to see the service being so open and inclusive and demonstrating its commitment to its LGBT firefighters and staff. Also to see you, Assistant Commissioner, with the London Fire Commissioner, to have the rainbow stripes. That were very fetching and lovely. And although that's just a symbol, I think symbols are important, and of course the Fire Brigade Union as well. And finally, Chair, thank you for joining us as well. Okay, those are all the thank yous. Assistant Commissioner, can I talk to you about flooding? So we've spoken before about the need both to warn businesses and communities of the dangers of flooding, and also after how to deal with flooding. How well do you think the London Fire Brigade are dealing with these two aspects?
So I think this is an issue that's come to stark reality in terms of the threat that it poses to the capital. In terms of, if you look at where we were last year, July in particular, the busiest day in LFB's history as far as call volume was concerned. At one point, I think we attended something like 1,500 incidents within a 4-hour period. So wide area urban flooding is an absolute issue that we need to continually work on to make sure that we're, first of all, preparing communities that this is a genuine risk that they need to be aware of, and co-producing actually what that preparation looks like, which is where the preparedness service that's proposed within the Crmp will really come into its own to make sure that we're sharing the advice. We've just put up some recent advice on our own website at the moment, which has also been used by the Mayor in terms of making sure people are given that advice about what to do in the event of flooding, and the channels and the emergency numbers that they can use to get further advice. So we need to be constantly doing that. We need to make sure that our response arrangements are as good as they possibly can be to be able to deal with these types of incidents. We have throw lines on every pump, we have life jackets, we've got ejector pumps on every pump, which means we can pump water out of basements, but then you still have to make sure you direct the water in the right direction and it goes to the right place, that you don't cause an issue further down the road. As the FBU have already alluded to, we don't have a statutory duty as far as flood response is concerned, but that doesn't stop us responding. You know, we respond and we know that we've got a duty to the people that we serve to make sure we are there, and we have a capability to be able to do it. I think it is something we can always do more on. Although we're comfortable as far as the types of operational response we can put together. You know, we've got 10 surface boats that we can use. As I say, we've got life jackets, throw lines that we've got on our appliances. We've got firefighters who are very well trained to deal with water incidents. But as has been discussed before, particularly with flooding, prevention is very much better than cure. It was one of the things actually that was highlighted by the stand that we ran at the Chelsea Flower Show earlier this year, and the subsequent publicity that came from that, which was about people thinking about how they use their front gardens or yards in particular. And actually, if you do completely concrete those up, that has an issue in terms of how floodwater in particular is able to drain away. And that's just one example of how we are able to highlight this issue that then will have an impact in terms of how people behave and think about the lived environment within which they're in. But there's still an awful lot more we can do, I think, as far as flood response is concerned, but which is why it's critical that it's in our planning for the future, because the impact of climate change is clearly going to be something that we're going to be contending with over the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years and beyond. It's something the FBU have raised, you know, over a long period of time, and now we are actually starting to see what were regarded as quite unique events becoming much more regular, and that means the London Fire Brigade and Fire and Rescue Services nationally have to be as prepared as they possibly can be for dealing with the inevitable, sadly, that is going to happen over the years ahead.
Yeah, that's really well articulated. One particular aspect of it I'm particularly concerned about is the impact on disabled people. Now, I've spoken to the Fire Brigade Union, particularly around the government seem to be signalling that they seem to be getting rid of PEEPs for personal emergency evacuation plans. How concerned are you about the loss of PEEPs and the impact that this might have on the disabled community?
Well, I think just to reiterate, I think what the Commissioner was saying at the last FRET meeting around PEEPs, we're obviously respond back as part of the consultation on PEEPs, but clearly issues of vulnerability, whether it's to do with flooding or whether it's to do with a high-rise fire, is something that the LFB absolutely has to be front and centre of our incident planning to make sure that we're giving that equity of response to every Londoner who's involved. So it's, as I say, to quote the Commissioner before, sort of taking a step back from the politics and actually looking at the response itself. We have a duty as an emergency service to make sure we are responding to the needs of all Londoners.
Thank you. If I can turn to you, Moira, just to ask, how prepared do you feel as a community, both where you represent, but also, if you can take the question more generally, about how to what to do to prevent flooding, but also if there was a flood, what would your residents do in terms of what would their immediate actions be?
Well, we've been busy planting lots and lots of trees on our estate, and most of our blocks, our tower blocks anyway, there's like a space below, well, how do you explain it? That's non-residential, and most of the residents are from a floor up, yeah. We do have lots of old buildings that have a ground floor, and we're right near the River Thames. So other than planting trees, we'll be looking for the LFB to come and rescue us, I think.
As a Green, I'm always happy to hear people talking about planting trees, so thank you. Delaware, how about yourself for your community?
To be honest with you, that's never thought about this, about possible flood, because we have never experienced in this, well, especially in London, but in our area. But although the country I'm from, origin Bangladesh, we are used to flooding every year, and now this year, as you know, is a devastating flood. So we are very conscious of that, but here we feel that that it may never happen. But we know that the things are changing, and it can happen anywhere, the flooding, and we have to be mentally and physically prepared. So we need to do more thinking on that, actually, how we can prevent, help ourselves and work with others when it comes to flooding. The only flooding we experience actually at the moment is sometimes we get our lift shaft flooded, when there's heavy rain. So we have to, the water has to be sucked out. But we can do it ourselves. We don't have to call the fire brigade. But that if it then, so this is one of the things we've experienced so far. But that's something we need to think about seriously.
Thank you very much. And Fiona, if I can finish with you. I think Diluwa's answer there is really helpful and actually quite representative from my experience of talking to people in communities, that when you talk about flooding, they start to think about it and go, oh, this could be a problem, I need to do something. When you're looking at the CRMP, how do you balance the risks that communities will automatically be on their radar, things like fire, and those risks we were talking earlier about terrorism, but also I would say climate risks as well?
What we found really interesting in the response to our Autumn 21 consultation is actually a lot of people are concerned about flooding and they are concerned about terrorism, particularly in wide open spaces. What we found was that there wasn't a kind of collective understanding about the service we can provide to support people to prepare themselves to avoid the damage that a flood might have. So that's why when you look at the sort of assessment risk section of the CRMP, you'll see there's a section there that says we're bringing in new services. The preparedness, engagement and recovery services are really, really important in this area. Now, there are things that we do already to certain extents, but not in a really, really structured and cohesive way. So that whole piece about preparedness is all about supporting people, understanding the local risks. And again, it will be different in different boroughs. Some boroughs are at the top of a hill and some are, on the banks of the Thames. And it's really about supporting our local fire stations to be able to go and have those conversations about the risks that are relevant in that borough. So we're introducing borough risk plans to enable each borough team to understand the risks that are local to them. And if flooding is a key risk for that particular borough, then working with the communities to think about actually what do we need to do to prepare for this? Is it sandbags? Is it something else? Is it thinking about how we utilise the space that we might have? So that's kind of the approach that we're taking to it.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, I'm mindful of time, so Assemblymember Bakari has a very quick question
I'll
be
move very on to quick. I have highlighted this before with the LFB. It's the way that you can combine your work with local councils and councillors and their training. So this is not just about fire safety, but also about flooding risks, because I think we cannot miss out the fact that Diluwa just mentioned, I didn't think about this. Now, local councils have a real role here. Local councils have a real role here. We must make sure there's some area within your plan that really highlights the role that local councillors have, and to make sure they have the right training to communicate the different aspects that the London Fire Brigade have, the local councils have, planning, all sorts of areas that I think the local authorities need to be communicating better at talking about front gardens, because your garden is a very good example of what you did in Chelsea Flower Show about having permeable front gardens. All of this needs to be part of the work that you do within the plan about how we work with local councillors and councils. Would you not agree?
I would absolutely agree. And that's part of the whole approach with local risk assessment, so local risk plans, is that they aren't developed in isolation by our uniform colleagues. They're developed with the local councils and they are shared, so that we have a shared understanding of the risk so that we can work together to address it and mitigate it. So that will take us part of the way there, but I absolutely recognise there will always be more to do.
Okay, thank you. And we're going to move on to a changing London, which is our final topic today. Assemblymember Cooper.
Thank you, Chair. This follows on really from the questions that we were just having about flooding and looking to the future in terms of the changing climate. And one impact of the changing climate is that obviously as the air heats up, it's able to carry more moisture. So we have these the likelihood of extreme weather events. I don't think we're quite going to achieve the Sundarban level of flooding over the whole of London, but individual days when there's very heavy rainfall, we have already seen that. But it's not just about flooding. It's also, I think, about overheating, and there are other risks that I think the fire brigade is going to be involved in. And we've put up a lot of buildings in the city, not sure there's sufficient shade. There may be times when you could be called to buildings where people are large numbers of people are fainting, and in a really bad way because of the heat. And we just wondered how far you feel that the community risk management plan anticipates these emerging threats to human life beyond just the basic fires that you've been responding to and the flooding, which obviously you do respond to as well, in terms of climate change up to 2029 and beyond. I'll start with Fiona and then maybe come to Jonathan.
Yeah, John, I think it's better to cover off the more technical aspects, but the kind of things that I would point to is looking that there's kind of two aspects of this for us. One is about how we future-proof our service and how we make sure that everything that we do and the footprint that we have on London is as carbon neutral as possible. And there's an awful lot of work going on there so that we are making the best contribution that we can to the climate change agenda. Then there are aspects of the change in built environment, as you rightly mentioned there, and our approach in terms of responding to building consultations would consider the kind of the fire safety aspects, which have to think about some of the issues that you've described. And then there's also the point about, you're absolutely right, flooding is not the only consequence of climate change in London. We have outdoor fires. We have, I've forgotten the phrase for it. What's the phrase?
Wildfires.
Thank you. Wildfires. As well as a range of other issues that arise from equipment overheating, let alone anything else. You know, we saw in Glasgow, I think it was a couple of summers ago, that the kind of the surface of a building melting because they hadn't anticipated that it was going to be that hot in Glasgow. So there's all those kind of issues that we have to take into consideration along with all of the other parties when they're developing buildings. But John, I don't know if you want to talk about wildfires.
Yeah, so the issue of wildfire, if you want to look at a National Fire Chief Council conference that's always extremely well attended, it's now the wildfire conference, because that is becoming an extremely pertinent issue for all fire and rescue services to deal with, including London, which on the surface you wouldn't necessarily think was a huge issue to us.
Well, we did have Wanstead Flats, and that became quite serious.
Exactly, which was a 40 pump fire, which was extremely serious. I was at a 15 pump fire the other day, which was on land that was tinderbox dry and had caused a significant fire, which actually, if it hadn't been for the actions of...
There was one just down the road from me, I suspect.
Yeah, Norbury, that's the one, in Norbury,
yeah.
Which if it wasn't for the actions of those initial crews, could have been a lot worse than it was in terms of impacting on people's houses. So the issue is very much a real one. We've got wildfire tactical advisors now in London Fire Brigade who are able to provide that tactical advice to incident commanders like myself to make sure that we're using resources in the right way. We've obviously got high volume pumps and national resilience assets that we're able to deploy both within London and nationally. If you look at national resilience for the Fire and Rescue Service, the equipment that is deployed most often is our high volume pumps, and they are often going to wildfires. So it is a clear and present danger for us. It's absolutely central to our risk management planning moving forward. We have to make sure, both in terms of our firefighter development training, that the risks of wildfire and climate change more broadly are part of the syllabus to make sure that firefighters are prepared and ready to do with this. And you only have to see the learning from our colleagues in Greece, Australia, the States, in terms of what that can look like. And London firefighters actually went to Australia recently to assist with some of the wildfires that they had there, because we are building this expertise now, both within London and nationally, to deal with these types of incidents. But it's why the CRMP has to enable that flexibility to make sure that we can flex as this starts to develop, because although we can see how this is playing out, both in terms of flooding, both in terms of wildfire, there may be other elements to it. And the point you raise actually about people within buildings is an interesting one, because there was a heat wave, I remember, in France about 20 years ago, I think it was, where actually a large number of people died as a result of overheating in their homes, and it actually exposed a number of demographic challenges around vulnerable people living on their own that France hadn't quite experienced until that incident happened. So we need to plan that into our thinking, that we have got people who are very vulnerable, could be vulnerable to extremes in heat, and the other way as well in terms of cold, and making sure our crews are prepared and equipped accordingly, which is why it's key that it's one of the risks identified in this document.
I mean, if you look at Sydney at the moment, it does look like the Sundarbans because it's completely flooded, and they've also had exactly the opposite, as you say, in terms of wildfires in Australia have been absolutely a huge problem. Sorry, you wanted to come back.
If I could just add one more thing, so part of our consideration of emerging risks and future risks is about population change. So we know that climate change globally is creating mass migration, and that is one of the reasons why it's so important that we engage with all of our local communities. You know, we already know that there are over 300 languages spoken in London and communities that come from all over the world. That's only going to increase as this issue kind of becomes more and more acute. And so it's really important for us that we stay really closely grounded to our local communities. We understand how those local communities are changing so that we can make sure we support people as they're coming here to make sure they are best protected and prepared for things that might happen.
So there's 2 points I just want to raise, and I want to bring in Dave Schreck as well on this. The first one is you quite rightly raised the issue of Paris, and that was a demonstration of what's called excess summer deaths as opposed to excess winter deaths, which I think we're all very sadly familiar with, and I think next winter, because of rises in fuel prices, we might find that there's quite a spike. But after there's been a period of excess heat, about 2 or 3 weeks later, there is a distinct rise, I'm very sad to say, but in the number of people having heart attacks. The community that is predominantly affected by this is the older community. So one of the other things that's been happening in London has been the demographic change. And I just wondered how equipped in terms of the fire safety visits, whether or not you're able to give people advice on those visits, also about making sure that they are sufficiently hydrated. The older community, making sure that people who are perhaps not as mobile, and if they're in a building that starts to overheat, sometimes people are still worried about opening their windows. Is that something that's now being incorporated into advice to people at home, particularly who are older?
So I think that raises a really interesting question, actually, in terms of we're currently in the process of reviewing our home fire safety visits at the moment in terms of how we deliver them and making sure that when it's a physical visit, it's to our most vulnerable, and as you quite rightly articulate, that tends to be the older population living on their own. I think that's a very sensible suggestion in terms of making sure that we incorporate advice in terms of how to keep yourself safe, whether it's extreme heat or extreme cold, as part of that well-being that we should be delivering to vulnerable people. So I'll take that away. I think that's a very sensible suggestion in terms of how we make sure we're dealing with the
fuel prices might be going up, but the cost of water is still incredibly low, and encouraging people to properly hydrate is so important during these summer heat waves. Another thing that is really important, this is why I wanted to bring in Dave, if I may, Dave Schreck, is the issue of what people wear. Now, I've looked at the new firefighters' uniforms, and obviously they are invented and they are very good at, I hope, in repelling a situation where you find yourself in a fire. However, they look quite hot to me, and I just wondered, are they hot? So if you're attending a wildfire, how are they working out? And is that an issue for firefighters when they're out and about and it's a hot day? And I'd like Dave, if you want to come in first, Jonathan, but I was going to bring in both Dave and yourself. Do we need to have a summer uniform that still provides, the level of protection that we can, but also has particular areas, I don't know, under the arms and elsewhere, where people can definitely achieve something to help cool down? And again, the issue of hydration for the firefighter is extremely important, I think, here.
So you raise a really important point. So one of the reasons LFB joined in the national procurement of the current PPE that firefighters use is because actually it's much more both resistant in terms to heat and flame, as you would expect from a firefighter protective uniform, but also it's able to enable firefighters to sweat properly and to be able to cool down. Now, with that said, clearly a significant firefighting tunic when it comes to dealing with wildfires, whereas some of the time you might be using beaters or having to drag significant amounts of hose across fields and various other wild elements, is going to be extremely challenging for firefighters to do. So within a risk assessment, there's nothing wrong with an incident commander taking a decision that actually firefighters can remove their tunic as long as it's safe to do so, and we did so down in Norbury last week. I think the one thing I would say in terms of the PPE, it's as good now as it has ever been. As I say, one of the driving factors behind the national procurement was that, one, there were obviously economies in scale in terms of being able to procure that PPE, but also the standard and the quality of the firefighting kit. Now, you know, I've been in the fire service for 23 years. I suspect Dave will be similar. I think even when we think back to where we are now, it is unrecognisable in terms of the capability and the quality of the firefighting equipment that we're providing to our staff. But it is still a legitimate concern, the crew welfare, and is something that has to be in the minds of incident commanders. It's where our friends in the Salvation Army, for example, come into their own when they make sure that we're well hydrated and well fed when we're dealing with large-scale incidents. It's why fire appliances have got stocks of bottled water on there to make sure that the welfare of our staff is always at the forefront of our thinking. But we do have to continue to evolve and develop. I suspect the next generation of firefighting kit will probably, you know, take some of what you're suggesting into account, because actually the role of the firefighter in terms of dealing with other types of incidents other than what we would regard as our bread and butter type is going to continue to evolve, and that will probably mean looking again at the PPE that we ask our firefighters to wear.
So, Dave, and sorry, I might have inadvertently called you Shrek rather than Check. That was a slip of the tongue. Sorry about that. You look nothing like Shrek, clearly. The uniform, does it make people hot? Are people aware of how much they need to make sure that they keep well hydrated? Is that something the FBU has been involved in developing guidance around?
Yeah, thanks, Leonie. I've been called that a few times. It might surprise you to hear. But, yeah, so Jonathan wouldn't know this because he wasn't on the JCF at the time. But we did actually look into this as a union and propose about a lighter tunic, specifically with RTAs on hot summer days. There's other brigades that do it where you can actually get a lighter tunic so you don't sweat as much. It looks the exact same, but it's just a lighter version so firefighters don't get so hot. So he may not know about that, but due to funding issues and the cost of them, nothing came of it. I'll probably be able to dig out the work that was done because it went through health and safety, but in the end it was a cost issue that it wasn't purchased, and that was some time ago, so John wouldn't know. Just coming on to a few other points, again, there's a lot of talk about flooding and how we respond. In Wales, they spent 1.8 million getting new equipment for flooding. The Welsh government committed to that, but it appears we don't get any of that money, so it needs to be done centrally. So if we want to do all this work, it needs to be funded centrally again, because we can have all the great ideas in the world, but then when you can't afford the equipment, for example, a good example is that tunic. Leon, I'm glad you brought that up because I'd actually forgotten about it myself because it was quite a long time ago we brought it up. And again, it's funding, and obviously we want the best for people, but if it's funded properly, we probably have it.
Thanks. I mean, it seems a really important thing to me because looking at the level of heat that we've just been seeing across Spain and France in the past few weeks, and we know that we've had very hot weather here much, much earlier in June than we normally do, I think there is a trajectory here. I think we all acknowledge that climate change is actually happening. And I do think that maybe that's a recommendation, Chair, that we might want to make, that we do need to re-look at having a lighter weight and a uniform that is very, very much takes on board the possibility of overheating for the firefighter who's out on duty for a while. Thank you.
Thank you. I know we're going to go to Assemblymember Rogers, who's joining us online.
Thank you, Chair. I think this is a series of questions for Jonathan in the first instance. We've had a series of quite high-profile incidents involving alternative fuels. There was a recent e-scooter fire in a high-rise in Shepherd's Bush, and a few weeks back at Potters Bar bus depot, there was a fire that ended up taking, I think, 90 buses off the streets. Would you say that the brigade is adequately prepared to respond to these new risks? I know, for example, there's work going on with Imperial College London to determine proper ways to respond to these incidents. So, Jonathan, what's the fire brigade's level of preparedness here?
Thank you for the question. So this is one of those things that is at the forefront of our thinking as far as our operational response is concerned, because of the prevalence of lithium-ion batteries now in everything that there is. As far as our preparedness to deal with these types of incidents is concerned, so it's one of the things that actually LFB has been at the forefront, both in terms of our own thinking as a brigade locally, but also informing national guidance. As I referenced before, we've been involved in a collaboration with the National Fire Chiefs Council and Newcastle University to produce what is actually an excellent presentation in terms of how you deal with lithium-ion battery fires or fires involving modern vehicles and modern technology, how do you keep yourself safe, and then some of the particular challenges that we face. So I think on this particular subject, it's something that actually where LFB has been on the front foot. It's also still very much an evolving science in terms of how we deal with these types of incidents. You know, again, going back to the point I think Assembly Member Bailey was making about drawing upon international experience. There's quite a lot of work going on in the Netherlands and in Germany around this particular challenge, which is something we're keeping a very close eye on. I mean, at the moment, when it comes to dealing with these types of fires, the only thing you can do is try and treat them in a similar way to how we used to deal with acetylene cylinders, that you need quite a lot of water to make sure that you're keeping them cool, and where you can, isolate them and stop them from causing significant fire spread. The example you mentioned in Potter's Bar, actually the fire there, from what we understand, was actually caused by faulty maintenance, but there's no doubt that the prevalence of lithium-ion batteries in the fleet caused that rapid fire spread that we saw. So it's absolutely a critical issue for us to deal with. We are very much on the front foot as far as leading the national response to this is concerned. But again, it's an evolving science. So there's things around, you know, specific fire blankets we may be able to use, specific dry powders that may be able to be deployed onto lithium-ion batteries. This is a science where, in many ways, we're actually playing catch-up. The technology has obviously been around for a while now, and it is now continuing to evolve at pace. The numbers in terms of fires that we've seen over the last sort of 3 to 4 years in London are still relatively small, so I think it's still under 60 that we've been able to allocate to an e-scooter or an e-bike or something to do with lithium-ion batteries, so it's still relatively small. However, having said that, when you look at the development of this battery technology in particular and where we're going to be moving to as a capital and as a country, we have to make sure that we are even more prepared for these types of incidents, because we will expect them to become more common just because of the sheer numbers of these types of technologies that we're going to see. So as an Assistant Commissioner in LFB, I would never say content, because I think we have to be restless when it comes to this type of technology, because it continues to evolve. But I think we compare well when we look at national comparators within the UK in terms of the work that we're doing. You've referenced the collaboration that we've got with Imperial College as well as the University of Newcastle. This is all helping to influence actually what that looks like day to day for our operational response. So I think we are as well prepared as we can be at the moment, but I think there's absolutely an awful lot more we're going to need to do moving forward as this becomes a continuing and evolving problem, and science and technology is going to be critical, which is why I'm so pleased that we've now got a research and development team within our operational policy department to do exactly this work, that as we see technology develop and evolve and the challenges that faces, that then we're able to influence our own operational response so that we can deal with these incidents when they occur.
Thank you. Dave, if I could come to you. In my conversations with individual firefighters about these sorts of incidents, the subject of training comes up time and time again. A lot of firefighters don't seem to feel that they have the correct training to respond. What's your view on that?
Yeah, do you know, I've got a very similar view to what Jonathan said there. So we're actually doing work as well nationally on our health and safety in the Fire Brigade Union about this, because bringing it back to basic terms, in some cases, all you can do is chuck this battery in a massive container of water, and that seems to be it. So there's a lot of work to be done. I think firefighters are dynamic at the minute in the way they put things out, but I think there is work that needs to be done, really. So we are working actually with the London Fire Brigade through the Health and Safety Joint Committee, and that's where we are.
Yeah, I mean, again, firefighters say that what they would love, and I know this is difficult because the cost and all that, they'd love to be able to get access to some electric vehicles and take them to pieces in the way that you do with petrol and diesel cars.
Yeah.
Is that something that would be helpful? I know there's huge challenges with actually making that happen.
So I think it's something that definitely needs to happen in the future. Like Jonathan was saying there, the way that we're going as a world and as a country is we're going more electric. So it's going to need to happen, just like it happened with previous petrol cars, diesel cars. You need to train on these things to perfect your training, don't you? So it's going to have to happen as far as we're concerned. Again, we know it comes down to cost, doesn't it? Because these cars are very, very expensive. And
yeah, absolutely. I mean, if I go back to Jonathan, has there been any discussions on allowing firefighters access to these cars?
Yeah, so funny enough, there's been a discussion on exactly that point, because you're absolutely right. In order for our firefighters to be able to deal with these vehicles, if they're involved in a road traffic collision or if they're involved in a fire, we need to be able to practice and train with the vehicles themselves. Now, there are clearly a number of challenges with that, but I've spoken to our Assistant Director in Learning and Professional Development to actually try and think about how we can access manufacturers, because I think the one thing I would say here, there's probably a lobbying role for us as well to make sure that we get access to the manufacturers who are producing these vehicles, because there's a responsibility there that if they're going to produce these vehicles, and we would encourage people to use electric vehicles, clearly. But then there's also a responsibility that for all rescue agencies, whether it's the fire service or the ambulance or police, that we have access to these vehicles so that we can keep ourselves safe and are able to deploy our resources in the most effective way to bring any incident under control. So we are having active discussions about that. I know this point was raised with the Commissioner at one of our fire stations when he was doing his visits to stations that he's doing at the moment. And it's absolutely a legitimate thing that we need to do, and we are working as quickly as we can to enable access to these vehicles. But I do think there is a responsibility on the manufacturers to enable that to happen as quickly as possible.
Is there anything, could the Commissioner, could the Mayor put some pressure on the manufacturers to enable access for your firefighters?
Yeah, I think there is clearly a lobbying role to be done here. I know there's work that's going on through the National Fire Chiefs Council on this very point as well, to be able to lobby to government and to manufacturers that actually we have got access to these vehicles. Now, having said that, there are a lot of logistical challenges with obviously bringing vehicles to station forecourts and in drill yards. So there will be a lot of logistics we'll have to think around it. But when you consider the numbers of electric vehicles we're expecting to see, in particular on not just London's roads but nationally, this is something we absolutely need to drive forward, and it's referenced within the Crmp for exactly this reason. This is something we need to be more prepared for than we currently are.
Thank you. Briefly, on the two incidents I mentioned in my first question, the Shepherd's Bush incident, Potter's Bar fire, you touched on it briefly, but are there any further sort of initial lessons that you've learned from these incidents? I mean, I know with Potter's Bar you're going to be meeting with TfL, and I think you were going to be doing some follow-up fire safety audits as well at some of the garages. I don't know if those have drawn out any lessons.
Yeah, so like any incident, there's always lessons that we can learn to ensure that we can respond better going forward. In terms of the Shepherd's Bush fire, actually our crews operated extremely well at that incident to bring that incident under control as quickly as they did, particularly given that there was an e-scooter that was involved in it. But I think it was because we are now expecting to see these types of vehicles in flats and buildings within London that actually that's not coming as a surprise to our crews when they arrive. So having that knowledge means that we're able to deploy more dynamically and bring these incidents under control in a way that people would expect. There will always be lessons that we can learn, as Dave's alluded to. When it comes to dealing with these types of incidents, as I say, it's very similar to dealing with an acetylene cylinder, that essentially the only thing you can do is use copious amounts of water and keep it cool. One of the things that they do in the Netherlands, for example, is that they'll submerge a vehicle in an entire container and leave it there for 24 hours. Now, logistically, that's very challenging, but that's the sort of thing that's currently going on at the moment. I think what we do need, though, is new extinguishing media and technology, whether it's in the form of specific fire blankets or new dry powders that are able to deal with this incident. And that's where the academic liaison that we've currently got with both the University of Newcastle and Imperial College London, I hope really starts to bear fruit in terms of how we can change the equipment and kit and procedure and policy that we currently use so that we can bring these incidents under control as quickly as possible.
And again, you can see how the cooperation with the manufacturer would be extremely important.
Critical,
there.
yeah.
Thank you very much, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Assemblymember Bakari, I'm just going to remind members we have about 27 minutes left, so if we could keep our questions brief. Thank you.
To touch on the comment you made about lobbying, the government are just going to be have recently announced that as part of their planned update to the fire safety in purpose built blocks of flat guide, they'll be introducing guidance on safe storage of mobility scooters. Can you lobby as well to make sure there's specific reference to storing and charging of e-bikes and e-scooters, not just mobility scooters?
So I think again that's absolutely a legitimate point to raise. I know colleagues in the Prevention and Protection Department will make sure that e-scooters and e-bikes are part of that. And of course we've got some success as far as pushing forward lobbying is concerned around e-scooters and e-bikes in particular, which is part of the reason that they're not on the transport network within London, because actually we've been able to show, and to be fair to the Mayor and the GLA, they've taken that advice on board, that we don't want them on underground trains or on buses. So I think that's absolutely something for us to take away, but I am certain that our colleagues in Prevention and Protection will be lobbying to say exactly that.
And you mentioned the fact that you are relying on science and the development of science. This plan's going to go on for 6 years. So you are going to be committed to making sure that every time there's a change, there would be a change to your plan within those 6 years.
Yeah, so I think that's the critical part about the CRMP, that it's got that flexibility. And of course, it's also backed up with annual assessments of risk to do exactly that. So there'll be refreshed annual assessments of risk to make sure that actually we are continuing to be at the forefront of the challenges that we face, because as you rightly allude to, you know, this is an evolving piece that's going to evolve at pace over the next few years, and we need to make sure that our strategic planning is able to keep up with that.
And the government actually, you know, is encouraging the use of alternative fuels because of, you know, the need for change for saving the environment and having alternative fuels is the way forward. But there is a risk that there are people who are still not aware of this. London citizens, places of faith, schools, local communities. I mentioned local authorities needing to be involved. Will you also be working to make sure that the plan involves all of those aspects, all of those community groups, to make sure that everyone is very well aware of the need to make sure that we are safely storing scooters, e-bikes and e-scooters?
So that's absolutely, as Fiona's already alluded to, when we're talking about developing our borough risk management plans, and what that looks like, it has to be that we're able to join up all the dots between all of the key agencies and community groups, so that actually when these risks are developing and emerging and are actually with us now, that we're able to share that knowledge in as quick and effective way as possible, so that actually we are providing that education, that people understand the risks when they're using this new technology. And as I say, we would always encourage that we want to see, you know, environmentally sustainable technology being used, but people have to have the knowledge and the education to go with it, and that's where this local risk management planning, bringing all the key partners together to do exactly what you've just described.
Assemblymember Polanski.
Thank you very much. Fiona, I want to ask you about pay gap targets. So we currently you currently collect those for gender, and you're looking to do it for race and disability, and I believe LGBT is coming too, but the data is too sparse at the moment. What I've noticed, though, is that it says 0% in the longer term, but there isn't specific pay gap targets for right now. Why not?
Just going to find the data.
Sure.
Give me a moment. So what we are looking at doing in terms of pay gap is, we said in the longer term that this will be 0%. What we're trying to do is make sure that as we understand the data now, and we understand what the pay gap is now through our annual reporting, we set ourselves a trajectory so that we know that we're going to achieve that target. Aspirationally, we'd like it to be 0 now, but we know that it's not. And we know that it's different in different parts of the organisation as well. So what we want to do is set ourselves an annual target that will enable us to move towards 0 over a period of time. And that also requires us to think about our staff composition, because then they're intrinsically linked, aren't they? That pay gap reduces as your staff composition becomes more diverse. So those two things are going to work together. That's how we intend to do it.
And it seems strange to ask for a target, but when do you think you'd be able to be more specific about when you think that trajectory will be?
Yeah, no, that's an absolutely fair question. So our intention is that in the run-up to January 2023, we work through all of the areas on our metrics document where it says under development, so that we can start to test in the first year whether we've got that right or not. And then we can make that more solid for year 2, year 3, year 4. So I would anticipate that by the beginning of the CRMP, we would have a trajectory for that pay gap.
Thank you very much. Can I turn to Dave from the Fire Brigade Union? Do you believe, Dave, the CRMP has sufficient focus on the health and well-being of brigade staff? And what more could it be doing?
I'll go back to what I said at the start there, is we don't have enough detail. So, I mean, when you look at that, there's not really anything you can say about it until you hit the specifics. Obviously, I'm not going to disagree with we want equal pay at all, but there's just been no specifics given to us on it. So I'll be interested to speak to Fiona. Probably, obviously, it's not for here because unless she wants to go into it a bit more, but I need more specific detail on that.
Thank you. And Fiona, if I can just follow up on that too, and just ask really what plans the LFB does have in place to support staff through the adjustments or changes that the CRMP will maybe inevitably cause.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a whole range of things here. So the element of the plan that is important to kind of give the detail is the delivery plan. So the delivery plan brings together the pillars, the commitments, the programs into a set of projects and work streams for us to deliver. So that's where we start to flesh out the detail of what the changes might be, particularly in terms of well-being. There is a whole program around improving well-being and the health and safety of our staff. There's more than one aspect to this. One is about your mental health and well-being and how we look after each other and provide tools and support to look after each other. And the other part is our health and safety at work and our level of tolerance for non-compliance with health and safety requirements, for example. So one of the key things that we're looking to do over the next year is start a campaign amongst all of our workforce around the things to help each other to make us safe at work. So reducing our number of road traffic accidents, reducing our number of RIDDOR events, for example. And that is all contained in the appendix to the plan. But Dave, I'm really, really happy to talk you all through that, because at this stage, these are proposals. And our intention is that over the next year, we work through the detail of these proposals with our colleagues, with our communities, to make sure that we are developing programmes of work that will deliver the outcomes that we want. And that if they don't demonstrate the right return on investment, that we think about how else we might achieve the outcome. So we really want to work together to deliver the detail of these plans, rather than just say to everybody, this is what we're doing, because we feel that that's not an inclusive way of doing it.
Thank you. I'm being tapped. Is that
Yes.
back to you, Chair?
I'm just going to bring Assemblymember Moema in here.
Thank you. Just very quickly to Fiona, I wonder then, what was your your gender pay gap in the last round of reporting? Because I think it's good to have the purpose of the legislation is to drive that down to zero for everybody. So it should be the case that you'd have an idea of what that is at this point. So what was it at the last point of reporting?
I don't have that information with me today, but we can certainly provide that for you. We report every year on it, so we do know what it is.
Because I think, and you also said that it might be different in different parts of the service.
Yes.
And no doubt if you're trying to encourage more women and people from minority ethnic groups to join the service, it would be helpful to understand where those gaps need to be closed.
Yeah.
Because I welcome the fact that you're looking at an overarching target, but those gaps are actually quite useful tools. So you may have a part of the service where there is a negative gender pay gap, but that might mask the fact that lots of women might work in that particular area and inform other parts of your practice. So I think it'd be really good to have that to the committee.
Yep, so our annual pay gap report provides that kind of information.
Okay.
And we know that, for example, in some areas, there's, in our FRS, so our non-uniform colleagues side of the organisation, that there is a negative pay gap, if I'm getting that right, because it's a different makeup of staff, as you can imagine. But all of that detail is provided, and we do report on it every year, so we're going to use that as the foundation.
It's just it would be helpful for us to it's difficult to interrogate without that data. So
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
We're happy to share that with you.
And I see Dave Sheck has his hand up. Dave, did you want to come in?
Yeah, just the pillars were mentioned in this document. Talking completely frank, I don't know what the pillars are. Or we had a mass meeting in the northwest area where a lot of firefighters and staff at station attended, and I went round the room and asked them, how do you understand this? And not one of them understood it. But a lot of the stuff that came back was, it's just the usual rhetoric that comes back. So to add that to the CRMP, it doesn't fill me with that much confidence, because people on station don't understand it. So I just wanted to get this in there because that's where we are with it. And we have raised concerns about this for a long time now, about the pillars and how it isn't communicated properly down to station.
Okay, Jonathan.
Yeah, just to respond to that point, and just for members' awareness. So in terms of the CRMP and where we are, and making sure, because Dave raised a perfectly legitimate point that actually our staff need to understand this and they need to take part in the consultation, and we need to hear their views. So we've met with all station commanders and borough commanders twice now to talk through the CRMP, so that actually they can ask any questions that they've got. We've heard examples of how our borough commanders are really driving that engagement at a local level. We are running a series of watch briefing sessions actually starting next week with all stations and all watches, where there will be a question and answer opportunity for them to raise directly with myself actually. Questions about the CRMP, what it means and how it's relevant for their day-to-day work and experience moving forward. I mean, as Fiona's alluded to, this is a document that's about developing our strategic plan moving forward, but it may well be subject to change depending on the results of the consultation. But it's absolutely critical that our frontline staff understand the direction of travel that we're moving in, that utter commitment to being embedded in our local communities, and how those pillars and commitments actually translate to their day-to-day lived experience on station as well. So I think it's a legitimate pushback for us to make sure that we're communicating that in as effective way as possible. But we will be doing that now with the remaining time left in the consultation to make sure our staff are as engaged and as knowledgeable on the CRMP as we know they will need to be.
Thank you. And now back to Assemblymember Polanski to finish off that section.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you for your transparency on this, and also your commitment, Fiona, to meet Dave for Fire Brigade Union. I think that's excellent. Just finally, so I want to turn to Commitment 6, which is we will work together to provide the best possible services to meet your needs. Now, as I understand it, the only measure to be used is for people's survey question. I would recommend LFB is a great place to work to my friends and family. Do you think this is enough for the committee, the brigade and the mayor to be able to assess if the commitment's been achieved?
So the metrics that we're talking about within the CRMP are public-facing metrics. So they're the things that we think at this point are what our communities are most interested in hearing about. Now, we may find from the consultation that we have to adjust that, but in terms of this one, there will be quite a lot of other metrics that come out of the People Survey that we will look at internally. But what we have found and what best practice shows is colleagues' preparedness to recommend working for their organisation as the place where they would, as somewhere great to work, is generally the best measure of how people feel about the place that they work in. So we think it is a really valid measure, but we will have other measures internally as well.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Yep. And now over to Assemblymember Moema.
Thank you. So my question is in two parts. The first part is to the Fire Brigade, to you, Jonathan and Fiona, and that's around whether or not the brigade has assessed the costs and resources required to deliver the CRMP, and do the new projects detailed in the delivery plan have agreed budgets. But if I could also ask a slightly different but related question to Dave, to think about while we get the answer, which is that, just in light of what you said about the funding available, that there is obviously an expectation that you and as a workforce, your members, will be the ones that are going to be delivering effectively against this. And I know that you're not involved in the budget setting necessarily, but what your view is on funding, given your previous comments about the funding situation that you face, and just comments around equipment not being available because it was too expensive. So let's start with you and then come back to you, Dave.
Sure. So your question is around the extent to which the plan has been budgeted and costed. So in terms of the individual programmes and projects, we're at very early stages in developing those. The approach that we will take is that we will do a full business case approach to each of those programmes of work. We haven't been able to do that yet because we've been developing the overall strategy. And we will take each of those in their merits. And as I said, if they don't provide the return on investment that we require, we will then think about, well, actually, what are the alternatives that are better in terms of cost benefit to enable us to achieve that outcome. So at this point, there isn't a detailed budget that sits alongside the CRMP for a 7-year period. Our budgeting process works on an annual basis as part of the GLA. We feel at this stage that our forecast for our budget will broadly cover the commitments that we've made, but obviously we will need to consider each of the business cases for each of the projects and programmes as we work through. And we may need to make some choices as we go through that process. But what we're absolutely not intending to do is create a situation where we've created a high-level strategy, an overarching delivery plan that then commits us to delivery that we can't afford. That's why we've taken this kind of stepped approach to it, to make sure that it's affordable and that we're able to flex as we progress through the years, because we don't know what the next few years are likely to be like for all of us.
Okay, but surely there would be, in outlining the strategy, you'd have an idea about how much each of the items would cost to deliver. So even if it's not kind of perfect, in order again for us to interrogate value for money at some point, what do you have at least like a ballpark figure? I know that we do budget year on year, but to come back to through that budgeting process to say this is how much it will take to effectively make these changes, which are all required. And I guess the second part of that is that does that mean that how does that impact business as usual? Because a lot of that core funding will be about the core functions of the brigade and the service.
Yep, so that's a fair question. So in terms of our early work to support the work we've done so far, we've done very high-level ballpark costing based on what we've seen in other industries. We did that with the consultants that worked with us to enable us to understand at a very high level what the range of costs might be. I haven't brought that information with me today, but I'm very happy to share that with you separately. But as I say, the approach that we're trying to take, we know that there will be affordability issues as we progress. Part of the plan is about looking at how we can be more efficient and effective in our service delivery. So that the intention there is that gives us space to use the investment to support our change.
And if we could come to you, Dave, if you've had any thoughts or reflections on that.
Yeah, so I think probably a lot of people here saw that we had concerns with the budget growth that went in, and it mostly went into departments like people services. I haven't got the figures in front of me today, but it was over 8 million. I know that it was over 8 million went into this department and was agreed. We did attend a meeting where we raised them concerns, and it was said that there was going to be an investor save. It does concern me that Fiona couldn't answer your question there on how that's going to happen, because they couldn't answer the question to us either. So I'm glad this has come up. And now we're being told that we need to make efficiency savings of 11 million. So from my point of view, surely we need to review that growth bid that went in before, because the Assembly can't seem to get answers, and neither can we. So why isn't that being reviewed? I think that's something that probably needs to happen. There is also the general question about funding, and I do believe the Mayor needs help centrally from the government to help fund the service properly. And obviously, if you fund it properly, you can get better equipment.
Thank you. Yeah.
If I might just come back on the growth bids, without going into too much detail, a range of some of the investment for this year is around modernising the services that we provide to support all of our staff. There has been a level of underinvestment in the past, and in terms of our support services, whether that's in people services, so in HR, whether that's in finance, whether that's in our project programme risk management kind of activity, LFB is behind the curve in terms of what a modern organisation should have. And this investment is to enable us to become a modern organisation and to better serve all of our staff so that they feel more comfortable at work, they're better supported at work, but that we do things more efficiently as well. So it's whilst I absolutely understand where Dave is coming from on it, it's an important investment for us. That has been done on the basis, particularly with people services, that there will be a return on that investment, and there is a commitment on that return on investment. The 11 million deficit in next year's budget is a one-year deficit, and we are looking at how we make efficiencies to enable us to meet that gap, whilst recognising we also got to look at how we utilise our reserves to enable us to address that gap. So we're working through all of that at the moment, and I'm sure that we'd be really happy to come back and talk to you about that when we finish that work.
Okay, that would be good. But that actually does take me on to my next question, which is to ask you whether you felt you had the resources to deliver without drawing down on the reserves that you have. I think it would be helpful to get an idea of how that 1 year £11 million saving would be found. In most cases, not always, but it's a case that obviously you look to staffing and headcount, which, understanding how that will work, if you're about to invest in your back office functions, where that money would be saved would be really helpful to know. But just, yeah, understanding how you're going to fund some of those changes and whether or not that will impact your reserves.
That's something we're working through at the moment in terms of our utilisation of reserves for the future years. Because obviously we know as an organisation that there are some areas of cost that will increase that are beyond our control, whether that's fuel prices, you know, those kind of things. And so we're looking at how we utilise our reserves to support us through that period. As I said, that work hasn't finished yet, so and it would probably be better for our Corporate Services Director to give you more detail on that, but we'll be very happy to do that.
Okay, and it would be very helpful to have that, and also maybe to have an understanding of how you will be monitoring the CRMP and reporting, and how that would be reported public, I mean, in quarterly, month, I don't know, whatever cycle you may agree. It'd be really helpful to have that data as well. And I suppose perhaps we can come back as a committee to the idea that you've got your 6-year plan, but year on year you're thinking about how to make those spending decisions, and then you are facing this £11 million deficit next year. How that's going to be filled, just in light of the way that public finances are right now, and potentially future pressures, to be helpful.
Yeah, so really happy to come back to you on that. And in terms of how we will measure delivery against the CRMP, that's where the metrics come in that we talked about earlier. So the metrics across all aspects of our service delivery. That will be our way of understanding the extent to which we are delivering the outcomes that we're committing.
And then to, again, the Fire Brigade, to LFB, and to today to the FBU, how will the Brigade be supporting the mayoral priority to make best use of fire stations, and how is this reflected in the CRMP?
So I was actually going to come back on the budget bit there. Yep,
sorry, if we do that first. Yep. Go ahead,
Is that
Dave.
all right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I find it absolutely bizarre that there's been a growth bid that was agreed to save money, but no one knows how we're going to save money. I mean, I don't know whether anyone else is in the same boat as me, but that just sounds like madness to me. But like I said, we've got the issue with, we've got a lot of problems with staff, the amount of staff on front line at the minute that should be addressed. Surely that money could have also been used there. I'm lost for words, really, because I still don't know how we're going to save money. No one has explained it here to me. And I'm sitting here, I don't know if anyone else in the room has got it, but we're saying we're going to come back, but that money's been given. See, we've given money without knowing how we're going to save future money. I just don't understand how that's happened.
May I come in?
Yes, if you want to.
Okay,
Yep.
so there's two issues here that we're talking about. One is the budget gap next year. And we are working through, as an organisation at the moment, what the potential efficiencies might be to enable us to achieve that gap whilst minimising the impact on staff. So what processes can we make more efficient? Where are we spending money that we might not need to be? And we're asking staff across the whole organisation to help us to consider that. You know, there are people at stations, there are people in different locations that have very strong views about some of the things that we do that aren't as efficient as they should be. So we're seeking views from everybody about how we might address that gap. In terms of the growth proposals for this financial year, which is different to the gap for next financial year, the commitment was made to make a return on that investment by our people services team, on the basis that the investment is around improving our HR services. It's around improving the way we support our staffs. It's about helping us to reduce things like employee tribunals, because we are managing things better from the beginning. It's about helping us to improve our recruitment process, speed up our recruitment process, help people with promotions, help us with retention, help us with our in diversity and inclusion issues that we've got. So all of those things come together to enable us to become a better organisation. And actually there are savings that come alongside that. Now we are still working out, and you know, I totally understand where Dave is coming from. We are still working through exactly where those savings will come as a result of that. But it is, again, it's known across many other organisations. If you invest in your HR function, you get a benefit by doing that. So there is absolutely a benefit associated with it. Have we written down the exact amounts yet for each part of the organisation? Not yet, but that is work in progress.
Thank you. I'm just going to move on to the mayoral priorities, and we're back to Assemblymember Moema.
Yep. Are you okay to pick up that question about the mayoral priority about making best use of fire stations, and then we'll ask you, and then ask you as well, Dave.
So just in terms of the fire stations themselves, so this to me goes to the heart of what we're trying to achieve within the CRMP, that actually our fire stations are not just places of work for our firefighters, to which we all feel immense attachment, spend a lot of time there, you know, form very close bonds at those stations. But actually they are seen as a genuine community asset for people to be able to use. You know, one of the interesting things actually, Assembly Member Polanski was referring to the Pride event on Saturday. Well, I was talking to a local artist actually who was telling me that he's giving his services for free to paint large sections of Soho Fire Station to make it much more sort of welcoming and warm, where you've got sort of grey walls and white walls, that actually fire stations can appear from the outside quite clinical spaces, and that we know from feedback that we've received they can, you know, from an appearance point of view, become perceived as being something other that don't actually belong to the local communities. Now that's not anything that firefighters are doing, because they feel very much attached to their local communities, but we've got to make sure we design into that space that they are perceived as warm, welcoming places that are not just a place of work for our fire crews, but actually they're community assets to be used by the local community. You know, there's things we're doing, practical things we're doing at the moment. We've got hub locations now at Lewisham and at Hammersmith that are able to be booked and used by community groups. We've also now got our FRS colleagues within LFB are able to book desks at different fire stations, so that actually they don't need to come into Union Street. They can go and work out of fire stations, and that will be culturally beneficial as well. We've got more people using fire stations, and then critically, that actually communities see those fire stations as places that they are welcome, that they can go there, they can engage with their local fire crews. I mean, myself and the Commissioner were at Woodford Fire Station about a month ago, and they just leave their doors open. They just leave their doors open, and they have a throughput of traffic there in terms of people coming through, engaging with firefighters. Now, clearly, you might not necessarily be able to do that everywhere because there's security reasons, but actually, there are things we can do and will do as part of this CRMP to make sure that fire stations are that genuine community asset that they need to be.
Dave, I don't know if you had any thoughts.
Yeah, I've always enjoyed community engagement myself, particularly when schools book to come down and you get to show people some of the things we do as a job. One of the issues I do have is fire stations, a lot of fire stations are not fit for purpose. Like, for example, the Middlesex stations, they're not fit for purpose for firefighters a lot of the time, and there's constant maintenance or trying to get maintenance in to fix things. So for me, that's going to be an issue. Again, I'll have to thrash out some more details of what the specifics are with the LFB, but definitely about whether the stations are fit for purpose is something that raises a big concern for us.
Okay. Thank you. And just so that investment that you're making, I appreciate it's in people services primarily, but as part of your forward plan, is there kind of some capital investment in, and is that something that you have discussed with the frontline firefighters, for want of a better phrase, about what their thoughts are?
So we have an annual capital investment plan, and that looks at the the life cycle of our assets in terms of their how can I use the right words, in terms of their current state, let's use that word, and the point at which they need to be maintained and renewed. So that then, Pumpstead Fire Station is a really good example of that, and that this year we have got investment included in our budget to look at how we consider Pumpstead Station to make sure that it's fit for purpose. So that is part of our normal process, normal day-to-day work, because we have to maintain that capital funding throughout.
Just on the point that Dave was making about the estate, one of the things I think is really important that we, and you know, I have to reflect on this myself and in my senior team within fire stations, is the work that our property department have done, particularly over the course of the last sort of 2.5 years, to completely transform how we go about planning and preparing our property estate. So you know, there's a whole redecoration programme that's being rolled out over the course of the next 5 years. There's a systematic plan to address a number of the issues I suspect that Dave's members and our staff have been raising at local level. Obviously, the estate for LFB is complex, but we are doing a whole range of works around privacy for all, for example, to make sure that our fire stations are open to everyone and that there are facilities there for everyone. Is making sure that redecoration programme is rolled out as quickly as possible, and there is a set plan for doing that. It's also things like putting solar panels on our fire stations, having electric charging points, making sure that fire stations are able to be used by other members of staff within LFB, not just operational firefighters. So there's a comprehensive plan in place to work through our estate to make sure that our fire stations are where they need to be. I think the reflection I would take away is that we need to communicate that better to make sure that front-end staff are aware that's happening, because that's really important, that they can see that there's a plan in place to actually address some of the property needs they may legitimately raise.
Okay. I'm aware we've kept you 5 minutes past when we said we would keep you. So the final question is from Assemblymember Polanski. I'm going to leave it up to our guests from the Fire Brigade if they want to send a written response, or if you want to just respond to Assemblymember Polanski now.
Thank you. So this is for the Assistant Commissioner. We've talked a lot about climate in this session today, and also we know the Mayor has this net zero target of 2030. What would you say is the biggest target what is the biggest challenge for the brigade in meeting that net zero target?
Well, I think when we look again, this is an area where I think we're actually on the front foot as far as trying to work for. So I'm sure you'll be aware that we're involved with a project at the moment about an electric fire appliance. So one of the big challenges when you look at our pumping vehicles in particular is the amount of power that they require in order to operate the pump and push water through. So actually to be involved in that project, which is cutting edge as far as what that needs to look like moving forward, that has been one of the biggest challenges when you look at our fleet, particularly our pumping appliances, actually making sure that we've got the technology, the battery power technology is there to be able to deliver the type of service that we know that we need to. We've obviously referenced previously our estate, and some of our estate is very new and very modern, and some of it is older. So it's making sure that we're addressing issues around, windows, the use of heating, taking out gas cookers, for example, and using electric. There's a whole range of measures that the brigade is utterly committed to net zero by 2030. I think there's a lot that we can do on the property estate that is probably more straightforward. I think when it comes to our pumping of fleet in particular, there are challenges there, but that's why we're involved right from the earliest opportunity, really, as far as what an electric fire appliance looks like and how that can be used. But we've also invested heavily in BMW i3s, for example. I think there's over 50 now in the fleet to make sure that our vehicles that we use on a day-to-day basis are now electric. But again, it's something we have to be relentless about in terms of making sure that we're going to meet our targets. They are challenging targets, they are stretch targets, but I think given the conversation we've had about the challenge from climate change, London Fire Brigade has to play its part of one of those anchor institutions within London to make sure that we're practicing what we preach. It's critical that we do that.
Thank you. And Fiona, finally, are you confident this will be represented in the CRMP?
Yes, there's a whole programme of work associated with it, which we've already started working on, which is about what are the steps that we need to take to make our entire estate carbon neutral.
Thank you both very much. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. That brings us... Thank you to all of our guests. We just have a few quick items of business. You're welcome to stay. It just takes a minute or two. can we note the report in today's discussion?
Noted.
Can we also delegate authority to me as chair in consultation with party group lead members to agree any output from this discussion? Great. And can the committee note its work program and the additional activity undertaken since its last meeting, namely the informal meeting with the London Fire Commissioner?
Noted.
Okay, and the date of the next meeting of the committee is the 22nd of September 2022 at 10 a.m. in the chamber at City Hall. I have no other urgent business, therefore I declare this meeting to be closed.
Thanks, Chair.
Thank you.
Very noisy in that meeting. Really getting involved.